Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a scribe sat down and wrote a list. Kings, cities, reigns. The kind of record-keeping that ancient civilizations did all the time. Nothing unusual about that. Except when you start reading the actual numbers, something stops you cold. The first king on the list, a man named Alulim of the city of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. The next king ruled for 36,000 years. Another ruled for 43,200 years. 8 kings in total, ruling before a great flood, with combined reigns stretching across more than 240,000 years of continuous kingship. Then the flood comes, everything resets, and the numbers start to shrink. But even after the flood, kings are still ruling for thousands of years at a stretch. Gradually, slowly, across hundreds of entries, the reigns get shorter, more human, until eventually you're reading about kings who ruled for decades, which is the range we'd recognize today. What is this document? Is it history? Is it myth? Is it propaganda dressed up as a royal record? Is it mathematical symbolism that looks like a timeline, but was never meant to be read as one? Or is it something stranger, something that blurs every category we'd want to put it in? This is the Sumerian King List, and it is one of the most fascinating, maddening, endlessly debated texts to survive from the ancient world. If you're using this to drift off tonight, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always check. It ends up being this strange, beautiful cross-section of the world, someone in Tokyo at 2 a.m, someone in Toronto just past midnight, someone in Cape Town with the window cracked. Whatever time it is where you are, you're in the right place. Now, back to those numbers. Here's what makes the Sumerian King List so compelling and so difficult to dismiss. It isn't obviously a myth. It doesn't read like a legend. There are no monsters, no gods walking among mortals, no magic swords or divine wars. It reads like a bureaucratic document. The tone is dry, administrative, almost tediously matter-of-fact. Kingly power descended from heaven, such and such city held kingship. This king ruled for this many years. Then kingship moved to the next city. Over and over, city after city, dynasty after dynasty, the list marches forward with the cool confidence of an official record. And then you notice that one of those officially recorded reigns is 43,200 years long, and the whole thing tilts slightly sideways. This is the central question the King List forces us to ask. When an ancient document looks like history but contains numbers that biology, archaeology, and basic human lifespan make impossible, what do you do with it? You can dismiss it as myth and move on, but that feels too easy because the later sections of the list, the parts after the flood, can actually be cross-referenced with other ancient records. Some of the kings mentioned turn up in inscriptions. Some of the cities match the archaeological record. The list isn't entirely fictional, so where does the history end and something else begin? That's what we're going to work through tonight, slowly, without rushing to conclusions. There are several serious theories about what those enormous reign lengths actually mean, and each one opens up a different window onto how the ancient Mesopotamians understood time, power, legitimacy, and the past. Maybe the numbers were never meant to be read as literal years. Mesopotamian math used a base 60 system, not base 10 like ours, and numbers carried symbolic and sacred weight that modern readers can miss entirely. A number that looks like 36,000 years might be communicating something entirely different to an ancient Sumerian audience than it does to us. Maybe the scribes who assembled the list were working with different units, shorter cycles, seasonal counts that we're now misreading as solar years. Maybe the long reigns were deliberate exaggeration, a political tool used by later dynasties to connect themselves to a mythic, almost divine past in order to cement their own authority. Or maybe, just maybe, Some fragment of genuine memory is buried in there, distorted by centuries of retelling, but pointing towards something real. Each of these possibilities has real evidence behind it. Each one has scholars who find it compelling, and none of them are mutually exclusive. The King List might be doing several of these things at once, which is actually how most ancient texts work. What we're going to do is start at the beginning. We'll look at what the King List actually is as a physical object and a literary form, how it was discovered, how it survived, and what it was likely used for. Then we'll step back and look at the world it came from, Sumer, the river cities, the invention of writing, the strange and specific way kingship was understood in ancient Mesopotamia. From there we'll read the list itself, the pattern of it, the rhythm, the way it builds toward the flood and then resets. We'll dig into those antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns, and then we'll look seriously at the mathematics because the numbers are not random. There is structure in them, and that structure tells us something important about intent. We'll explore whether those massive figures could represent something other than what we assume. Different calendar systems, different units of measurement, different cultural frameworks for what it meant to say a king ruled for a certain span of time. We'll check the list against biology, against other ancient records, against what archaeology has found in the ground. And we'll take a serious look at the political angle, because whoever compiled the King List was not doing it out of disinterested scholarship. They had reasons, and those reasons shaped what they wrote. By the end, we won't arrive at one clean answer, because the honest truth is that no one has cracked this completely. But we will have a much richer sense of what the list is actually doing, why it matters, and why those impossible numbers are fascinating rather than just wrong. There's something almost dizzying about sitting with a document like this. It was written in Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago. The civilization that produced it rose and fell long before Rome was a village, long before the pyramids were particularly ancient. The scribes who copied and recopied this list lived in a world so distant from ours that almost everything about their daily lives, their cosmology, their calendar, their political assumptions would be foreign to us. And yet the question the list raises is one we immediately understand. How long did these people actually rule? Were they real? Could any of this have happened? That gap between ancient strangeness and immediate human curiosity is exactly where history gets interesting. The Sumerian King List is not a simple document, it's not a hoax, and it's not straightforward history. It's something genuinely complex, a text that was used, revised, interpreted, and reinterpreted across centuries by scribes who may have disagreed about what it meant just as much as modern scholars do. What we have now is not even a single document, but a collection of tablets and fragments that sometimes contradict each other, sometimes fill in each other's gaps, and together form a picture that's vivid but incomplete. That incompleteness is not a frustration, it's an invitation. So settle in wherever you are, whether it's late at night or the quiet early hours of the morning, whether you're in a city apartment or somewhere much smaller and quieter. The first city on the Sumerian King List is Eridu, and according to the list, that's where kingship first descended from heaven. We'll start there too. And along the way, we'll ask what it means when a civilization insists that its first kings were almost incomprehensibly old, and what that insistence reveals about who they were, what they feared, and what they needed to believe. Before we can ask whether those reigns were possible, we have to understand what kind of document we're actually dealing with. Because the King List is easy to misread if you come at it with modern assumptions about what a historical record is supposed to be. Start with the most basic description. The Sumerian King List is a genre of text known from ancient Mesopotamia that does several things simultaneously. It records the names of rulers. It names the cities where those rulers held power. It gives reign length, sometimes in years, sometimes in other units, and it traces the movement of something the ancient Mesopotamians called kingship, as if kingship were a single object being passed from one city to another across time, rather than a political arrangement that could exist in multiple places at once. That last part is important, and we'll come back to it. But the first thing to understand is that a king list is not what we would call a chronicle. It's not a narrative. It doesn't tell you what the kings did, who they fought, what they built, what they believed. It just records them, name after name, city after city, with the same stripped-down formula repeated across hundreds of entries. Ruled for this many years, died. Next king. That formulaic quality is a feature, not an oversight. The king list belongs to a tradition of administrative and commemorative writing that was central to how Mesopotamian scribes organized knowledge about the past. It's closer to a genealogical register than to what we'd call history. And like a genealogical register, its purpose wasn't purely descriptive. It was doing something, making a claim, establishing a framework, creating a story about how power flowed through time, even when the document itself seems to be only listing names and numbers. What the king list is not is a neutral timeline. Modern historical writing, at its best, tries to be transparent about uncertainty, to acknowledge gaps in the evidence, to separate what we know from what we're inferring. Ancient king lists operated on completely different assumptions. They weren't trying to capture uncertainty, they were asserting order. The very act of compiling a list implies that these things can be listed, that there is a single sequence, a single thread of legitimate kingship running from the beginning to the present. In a region full of competing city-states, each with its own traditions and its own claims to authority, that assertion of a single continuous sequence was itself a political act. Not a neutral observation about the past, but an argument about what the past meant. This brings us to something that changes how you read every entry on the list. The king list was not written during the reigns it describes. The earliest versions we have date to around 2100 BCE, during a period called the Third Dynasty of when a king named Namma and then his successor Shulgi were consolidating power across a large portion of Mesopotamia. The antediluvian kings, the ones with those extraordinary reign lengths, supposedly ruled tens of thousands of years before any of this. The gap between when these events supposedly occurred and when anyone bothered to write them down is so vast that it swallows the kind of direct documentary evidence we'd need to evaluate them as literal history. What the scribes of were doing, in part, was reaching backward into a mythological past and stitching it to the more recent record, creating an unbroken thread where there may have been, in reality, a very long silence. Now, this doesn't mean the scribes were lying exactly. It means they were doing what ancient record keepers often did. They were assembling the past from available materials, oral traditions, older temple records, astronomical cycles, mythological frameworks, and shaping them into something coherent and useful. Useful being the operative word. A king list that demonstrated the deep antiquity of kingship itself, and by extension the deep legitimacy of whoever currently held power, was a document with real political value. In a world of city-states jostling for dominance, where your city's claim to supremacy rested partly on how ancient and sanctified that claim was, a list that said kingship descended from heaven and had been flowing through legitimate hands ever since was not just a record, it was a weapon of soft power. Here's where the multiple versions matter. Because we don't have one Sumerian King List. We have more than a dozen significant copies and fragments, and they don't all agree with each other. Some versions include kings that others omit. Some give different reign lengths for the same ruler. Some list dynasties as sequential that other versions treat as overlapping or simultaneous. The Weld Blundell Prism, which is one of the most complete surviving copies, gives a somewhat different picture than the Nippur tablets, which are among the oldest fragments we have. Scholars have spent considerable effort trying to establish a kind of composite or canonical version, but the disagreements between copies are themselves informative. They tell us that the King List was not a fixed sacred text handed down unchanged. It was a living document, copied and revised by scribes across different cities and different centuries, each of whom may have had slightly different information, slightly different purposes, or slightly different axes to grind. Some of the variation looks like honest scribal error, the kind of mistake you make when you're copying a long list of unfamiliar names in a difficult script by lamplight. But some of the variation looks like something more deliberate. Certain copies emphasize the prestige of certain cities. The inclusion or exclusion of particular dynasties sometimes tracks with the political interests of whoever was commissioning the copy. A scribe working in Lagash might have had reasons to include Lagashite kings that a scribe working in did not. A copy made during the reign of a particular dynasty might quietly extend that dynasty's entry or trim the reigns of its rivals. None of this was necessarily cynical, at least not in the way we might mean it today. It was just how ancient record-keeping worked. Memory was political. The past was something you managed, and yet there's a stability to the basic structure that runs across all the versions. The list always moves through the same broad phases: primordial kingship, cities holding power in sequence, the Great Flood as a dividing line, and then the post-flood dynasties gradually coming down to the more verifiable recent past. That shared architecture suggests the King List wasn't invented whole cloth by one scribe with an agenda. It was drawing on something older, some shared understanding of how Mesopotamian history was organized, even if the specific numbers and names were adjusted from copy to copy. For the city-states of Mesopotamia, this mattered in a very specific way. Think about the political geography. Sumer was not an empire in any simple sense. It was a cluster of independent cities, sometimes allied, sometimes at war, sometimes paying tribute to a dominant power, and sometimes shaking that power off. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Kish. These were not provinces of a single state. They were rival political entities with their own temples, their own patron gods, their own traditions. And legitimacy in this world was partly about antiquity. If your city could claim that kingship had resided there at some point in the deep past, that was not a trivial boast. It connected your city to the cosmic order, to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven, to a chain of authority that went back before the flood. A king list that placed your city early in the sequence, or gave your city's dynasty an impressive reign length, was doing something politically real. It wasn't just flattery or mythology, it was staking a claim about where your city fit in the sacred geography of power. Conversely, a king list that skipped your city entirely or demoted its dynasty to a minor footnote was a kind of erasure, a way of saying that whatever happened there didn't really count in the grand sequence of legitimate rule. So when you read the Sumerian King List, you're reading something that is simultaneously a cultural memory, a religious statement, an administrative genre, and a political instrument. It records, yes, but it also argues, and the argument it's making is about the nature of kingship itself. Kingship in this document is not something that any strong man can simply seize and hold. It's something that moves, that descends from heaven and can be lost, that passes from city to city according to some pattern that is never quite explained, but is clearly felt to be real. To hold kingship is to be the current vessel of something ancient and cosmic, and to compile the list that traces that movement is to claim the authority to say where it has been and, by implication, where it legitimately resides now. That's a lot of weight for a document that looks, on the surface, like a dry administrative record. But ancient texts often carry more than they appear to. The trick is to read them on their own terms, which is neither dismissing them as naive myth, nor accepting them as straightforward fact, but sitting with the complexity of what they actually were. Documents made by people who believed certain things, needed certain things, and found in the act of listing the past a way to make sense of a complicated present. The list exists. Its numbers are extraordinary. and the question of what it was made to do is inseparable from the question of what it means. To get from that abstract political instrument to the actual objects we study today, you have to slow down and imagine the physical world in which it existed. Not a PDF, not a scroll in an archive, but a damp, crowded city on the lower Tigris or Euphrates, smelling of mud brick and river water, where writing meant one thing above all: clay. Everything about Mesopotamian record-keeping starts there. A scribe in Ur or Nippur takes a lump of fine, cleaned clay, kneads it until it's workable, then shapes it into whatever form the job requires. A small pillow for a receipt, a flat tablet for a letter, a four-sided prism or a long, narrow tablet when you want to fit an entire king list in a format you can hold in one hand. While the clay is still damp, he presses a reed stylus into the surface, wedge after wedge, forming the tiny cuneiform signs. There is no ink, no flowing motion. Every mark is a separate impression. Every sign is a pattern of wedges that has to be memorized, chosen, placed. Writing the king list wasn't just a matter of copying words. It was a technical operation, almost a craft performance, carried out by people who had spent years in scribal schools learning how to do this simply, quickly, and correctly. Once the tablet is written, something important happens. It has to be dried. Many everyday records were left to air dry in the sun, hardening enough to survive normal handling, but still vulnerable. Drop one in a river, and it dissolves. Stack too many in a damp room, and the lower ones crumble. But some texts were more than temporary. Legal codes, royal inscriptions, canonical hymns, and in some cases king lists were fired, either deliberately baked in a kiln or incidentally hardened when buildings burned. That's one of the quiet ironies of ancient history. Fire is a disaster for the people living through it, but for clay tablets it can be a kind of salvation. An accidental palace fire that blackens the walls and collapses the roof can turn hundreds of fragile documents into ceramic. Burned houses become archives. Cities destroyed in war become time capsules. The tablets that carried versions of the Sumerian King List lived in this world of precarious survival. They were written, stored, handled, lost, broken, recycled, and occasionally preserved by catastrophe. And the ones we have now, sitting in museums under controlled light and temperature, are just the survivors that got lucky. So where did they spend their working lives? Where, in an ancient city, would you put a document that claimed to lay out the whole sequence of legitimate kingship? The answer, as far as we can tell from archaeology, is in the centres of power and learning. Copies of the King List have turned up in temple complexes, in royal palaces, and in the houses and courtyards associated with scribal education. That spread already tells you something about what the text was for. Temples were not just places of worship. In Sumerian cities, they were also economic hubs, landowners, employers, and repositories of tradition. A king list kept in a temple might be part of a broader collection of myths, hymns, and foundation inscriptions, anchoring the temple's god in a long sacred history of kingship. Palaces had their own archives, letter collections, tax accounts, treaties, lists of gifts. A version of the king list in a palace setting would fit into a different kind of project, a court's effort to situate the current dynasty within a venerable lineage, perhaps to be read aloud on ceremonial occasions, perhaps to be consulted when composing royal inscriptions. And then there were the scribal schools often attached to both temples and palaces, where students practiced writing by copying out canonical texts. For them, the king list was part workbook, part curriculum. A long standardized sequence of names and numbers is perfect for training attention, memorization, and the fine motor skills of writing. One of the reasons we have multiple copies at all is that generations of trainees sat hunched over clay, reproducing these lists as exercises. Out of this scattered landscape of tablets, a few particular manuscripts have become especially important. When people talk about the Sumerian King List, they're usually leaning heavily on one object, a clay prism known as the Weld-Blundell prism, now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's about the size of a hand, with 4 long, narrow sides, each covered in fine cuneiform. Unlike many fragments, it preserves a nearly complete version of the list as it existed around the early 2nd millennium BCE. The antediluvian kings are there with their immense reigns, the flood divides the list, and the post-flood dynasties descend gradually toward more historically anchored rulers. But the Weld-Blundell prism is not the original. It is itself a copy, written by a specific scribe at a specific time, centuries after the earliest versions of the King List we know. Other important witnesses, like the Nippur tablets and the Shile dynastic tablet, preserve older or alternative recensions. Each one is like a slightly different photograph of the same family, taken from a different angle, under different lighting. When you put them together, discrepancies appear. Even within the antediluvian section, reign lengths can shift. A king who rules for 36,000 years on one tablet might be given 28,800 on another. A minor dynasty can be inserted or omitted. A city's turn to hold kingship might be expanded, compressed, or rearranged. To someone used to printed books, this can feel like a problem. Where is the real king list? From the perspective of ancient textual transmission, though, this kind of variation is exactly what you'd expect. Copying a long cuneiform text by hand is slow, repetitive, and error-prone. Your eye can skip a line, your mind can transpose numbers. You might misread a damaged sign on your exemplar and replace it with something that looks plausible. When you're working with place names and semi-legendary kings you've never heard spoken aloud, the room for small mistakes is enormous. On top of that, scribes weren't always trying to reproduce an earlier copy slavishly. They could be harmonizing 2 sources, updating spellings, adding a recently discovered tradition, or adapting the text to local expectations. A version produced in Isin during a particular dynasty might be subtly tuned to highlight Isin's role and downplay a rival. Another city might have its own proud memories and insist that their founder has a place in the sequence. This is why modern scholars tend to talk about a king list tradition rather than a single text. The tradition has a recognizable core structure, a set of names and cities and formulas that recur. But every individual tablet is a snapshot of that tradition in motion. How, then, do we work with these things? How do you move from a dozen uneven witnesses to a usable understanding of what the king list was saying? Part of the answer lies in a set of quiet details that ancient scribes sometimes left for us: colophons, personal signatures, dates, little notes in the margins of history. A colophon is a brief inscription usually at the end of a tablet. It might say who copied the text, when, and sometimes from what. It can tell you that this version was made for the god so and so, or for the king, or according to an older tablet from such and such a city. Those few lines can anchor an otherwise floating text in time and space. Scribal hands matter too. Experienced Assyriologists can look at the way wedges are shaped, the spacing of the lines, the little habits in forming certain signs, and recognize that 2 tablets were probably written by the same person, or at least trained in the same school. That can link fragments together or suggest that a particular cluster of tablets reflects a single scribal tradition with its own preferences and quirks. Then there is internal consistency. Does this tablet use the same numerical system throughout, or does it suddenly switch styles halfway? Are the formulas introducing each reign the same, or do they change? Do the reign lengths add up to the total that's given at the end of a dynasty, or is there a mismatch that hints at a copying error? When one version preserves a coherent internal logic, and another looks scrambled, that's a clue about which might be closer to the scribal ideal. Scholars also compare the king list entries against other sources. Royal inscriptions, year names, building dedications, even economic records dated to particular reigns. When an archaeological king of is securely attested elsewhere, his position and reign in a given copy of the King List can become a reference point. If another tablet puts him in a wildly different spot, that version may be preserving a local variant or simply be confused. All of this work, reading colophons, studying handwriting, checking math, cross-referencing names, is slow and meticulous. It's the opposite of the sweeping narratives the King List itself seems to invite, but it's how we turn scattered, damaged, slightly conflicting pieces of clay into a coherent sense of what ancient scribes thought their past looked like. And it sets up a deeper question that will run through everything that follows. If the King List we read today is the product of centuries of copying, selection, and quiet adjustment, then those impossible reign lengths at the beginning are not just raw data dropped out of nowhere. They are numbers that survived this long chain of transmission, that scribes in different cities and different eras chose to keep, copy, and pass on. Understanding why those numbers were worth preserving will take us from the world of archives and scribal practice into the broader landscape of Sumer itself. Its rivers, its cities, and the moment when kingship became a way of organizing human life. To see why anyone in this world would care about a master list of rulers at all, you have to zoom out from the tablet and look at the land that made kingship seem necessary. Southern Mesopotamia, the lower basin of the Tigris and Euphrates, is not the lush, tree-covered paradise people sometimes imagine when they hear cradle of civilization. It's flat, almost aggressively flat. A low, silty plain built up over thousands of years by wandering rivers that flood, shift, and leave behind new layers of mud. Not much stone, not many trees. Summers that are blisteringly hot and dry. Winters that can be raw and windy. And water, always water, but almost never in the right place at the right time. Rainfall here is unreliable. You can't count on the sky to water your fields. What you can count on, more or less, are the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, fed by rain and snowmelt far to the north, roll down across the plain. They bring both life and problems. Uncontrolled, they flood unpredictably, rise and fall in ways that can wreck crops. Left to their own devices, they also wander, carving new channels, abandoning old ones, leaving some lands drenched and others parched. In that kind of environment, the difference between a starving village and a prosperous city is the ability to tell water where to go. That's the quiet heart of Sumerian power, irrigation. Not just one farmer digging a little ditch from a stream, but whole communities cutting canals, building levees, maintaining channels, measuring out who gets how much flow and when. Year after year, season after season. It's a kind of engineering that never ends. Mud silts up canals. Banks erode. Gates break. Every rainy season and every flood can undo months of labour. Managing this isn't just a technical problem, it's a social one. To keep the fields watered you need organisation. Who works on what? Who contributes grain or labour? Who decides when the canal to the barley fields opens and when it closes? And once you have that level of organisation, you have the basic material needed to create something like a state. Early Sumerian cities grew out of this watery choreography. Places like Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, Larsa. Each one began as a cluster of houses and fields linked to a canal system, tied to a particular temple and its god. Over centuries, those clusters thickened into dense urban centres, crowded neighbourhoods of mud brick houses, storage yards, workshops, and towering temple platforms rising above the flat plain. The city wasn't just a big village, it was a node in a network. Each city-state controlled its surrounding fields and smaller settlements, its canals and dikes, its labour force. And each one was acutely aware that its neighbours were doing the same thing just over the horizon. If you picture a modern political map with clean borders, you have to set that aside. Early Mesopotamian boundaries were fuzzy, defined less by lines and more by control over water and arable land. A canal running through a disputed field might belong, in practice, to whichever city could send enough workers and armed men to maintain and defend it. When texts talk about conflicts between Lagash and Umma, they are often about precisely this: who controls a stretch of fertile ground and the water that makes it productive. This is where rivalry enters the story. The same irrigation systems that allow you to support tens of thousands of people also create friction. Upstream cities can take more water, leaving downstream fields dry. One city can reroute a canal and quietly starve another's harvest. A bad year can push neighbours over the edge into raids, border skirmishes, and eventually full-scale war. So you have a landscape of competing city-states, all dependent on coordinated labour, all balancing on the knife edge of water management, all watching each other with wary eyes. Within each city, someone has to organise the work, store the surplus, settle disputes, and, when things go badly, lead men to war. Before you get to kings in the later familiar sense, you get temples. In the earliest phases we can glimpse, the temple complex to a city's main deity seems to have been the core institution. The temple owned land. It collected offerings. It stored grain in its granaries, livestock in its pens. It organized work crews to dig canals and harvest fields. It employed scribes to keep records, priests to perform rituals, and managers to oversee all of this activity. If that sounds more like a corporation or a bureaucratic agency than a purely religious institution, that's part of the point. In Sumer, the sacred and the economic were tightly braided together. The god of the city, in theory, owned the land and the people. The temple staff were the god's administrators. When labourers worked on canal maintenance, they could be described as working for the god. When grain was stored, it was the god's grain. When rations were distributed, they were the god's gifts. Within this system, certain humans inevitably rose above others. Some were high priests or priestesses, some were military leaders who had proved themselves in defense or conquest. Some were members of leading families who controlled key estates. Over time, their authority solidified, and new titles began to appear. Terms like Lugal in Sumerian, literally big man, which we tend to translate simply as king. The line between a powerful priestly governor and a king is not a sharp one. It probably blurred slowly as individuals combined religious prestige, military command, and economic control. A leader who could mobilize the temple's workers for a canal project, command its stored grain, and lead its armed retainers in war was already functioning as a kind of monarch, even if his job description still sounded like something else. At some point in this gradual evolution, texts start to describe kingship itself as a thing that exists above any individual human. In Sumerian and later Akkadian literature, kingship is sometimes treated almost like an object or a force, something that can descend from heaven, something that can be taken up by a city, something that can be removed and made to dwell somewhere else. That language tells you a lot about how power was imagined. In a world where the great institutions were temples, and where the ultimate owner of everything was a god, earthly authority made sense only if it was framed as delegated. A human could not simply decide to rule. He had to be seen as carrying a mandate that originated beyond the human realm. The god Inanna might bestow kingship on Uruk. The god Enlil might grant it to Kish. The office itself had a divine origin, even if the actual office holder changed. Describing kingship in this way had practical benefits. If authority flows from the gods, then loyalty to the king can be cast as loyalty to the divine order. Obedience becomes piety, taxation becomes offering, war becomes the god's judgment against an offending city. At the same time, this framework also creates a problem. If your city loses a war, if your dynasty collapses, How do you explain that without undermining the idea that your God chose you? This is where history, or something like it, becomes useful. You can tell a story in which kingship is not permanently tied to any one city. Instead, it moves. It is entrusted for a time to Eridu, then later to Bad Tabira, then to other cities in turn. Each city's rise and fall can be woven into a narrative of divine decision. The god gives kingship. The god takes it away. No one loss is final, because at some future time kingship might return. The Sumerian King List lives in precisely this ideological space. It presents a sequence in which kingship descended from heaven, and then, after each dynasty, kingship was taken to another city. That refrain is not just a literary flourish. It encodes a worldview in which political legitimacy is not a matter of brute force alone. It has to be justified within a cosmic order, in a landscape of rival city-states, each with its own god and its own proud traditions. Legitimacy could not be taken for granted. A ruler in Isin or Lhasa who wanted to claim more than local power needed a story that tied his authority into something larger and older than himself. A carefully ordered list of ancient kings stretching back before the flood and distributed among the great cities of the past provided exactly that. To appear on such a list was to be written into the long, slow rhythm of divine kingship moving through time. So when a scribe pressed those wedge-shaped signs into clay, recording that after the flood kingship was taken to Kish, he was not just preserving a curious set of numbers. He was participating in an argument about who holds rightful power, about how that power relates to the gods, and about how the present fits into a story that reaches back into mythic time. In that sense, the impossible reign lengths at the beginning of the King List are not an isolated oddity. They belong to a broader system in which everything about kingship is magnified, sacralized, stretched beyond the ordinary. To understand those enormous numbers, we have to look next at how the list itself is constructed, how kingship moves, how time is partitioned, and why the world before the flood seems to obey such different rules. If you sit with the Sumerian King List and just let your eyes move down the lines, one phrase keeps rising up at you. Then kingship was taken to, or in slightly different versions, then kingship was carried off to, or kingship was brought to city after city, dynasty after dynasty. That formula repeats. It becomes almost hypnotic. Kish, Uruk, Arwen, Hamazi, Akkad, Izin. Each one is introduced with some variation on that same refrain. On one level, it's just a transition sentence, the ancient equivalent of next up. But when ancient writers repeat a formula like that over and over, they're almost never being lazy. Repetition is one of the main tools they have to press an idea into the reader's mind. Every time you encounter the phrase, it does two jobs at once. It moves the story forward, and it quietly reminds you of the world view the story is built on. The key assumption hidden in that line is that there is one thing called kingship. Not many separate kingships, not dozens of unrelated little thrones each doing their own thing, but a single overarching office. A unitary, heaven-originated power that can live in Uruk today and Kish tomorrow, but is still, in some deeper sense, the same kingship. When the text says kingship was taken to Kish, it isn't saying Kish happened to get strong and start bossing its neighbours around. It's saying the cosmic franchise of ruling authority, the license to be the kingdom, has changed address. Someone in Kish is now holding the mandate that used to reside somewhere else. This is how you turn a landscape of messy, overlapping city-states into a single story. On the ground, Sumer and later Mesopotamia were never that tidy. We know from other inscriptions that there were often multiple kings operating at the same time, sometimes even in the same region. City A might claim hegemony over City B, while City C quietly refused to acknowledge either one. Alliances formed and dissolved. Usurpers appeared. Local strongmen held power without ever being recognized beyond a handful of villages. The King List smooths all of that turbulence into one clean line. Instead of overlapping rivalries, it gives you a sequence. First this city, then that city, one at a time, never more than one rightful bearer of kingship at any moment. Each move is decisive. Each transfer is total. Kingship doesn't split or share. It dwells here until something happens, and then it dwells there. That narrative neatness is doing ideological work. If there is only one true kingship, then only one current city can claim to embody it. Everyone else, whatever they call themselves, is at best a local governor playing at being king. The list, by structuring the past as a single file of proper holders, gives the present-day claimant a powerful line of reasoning. We are simply the latest stop on a long-distance journey that began when kingship descended from heaven. You can almost hear the argument that a court scribe in Isin or Larsa might have wanted to make. Yes, other cities have their stories, their local heroes, their kings. But this is the path of real kingship. It came to Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, and in the fullness of time it has come to us. We stand in that succession. We are not just powerful. We are legitimate. The repeated formula also implies something about how change happens. Kingship is never described as being stolen, seized, or fabricated from scratch. It is always taken, removed, brought. Those are passive, almost gentle verbs. They leave room for a divine subject, unspoken but understood. Who is doing the taking? Who is carrying? The gods. Fate. The same heavenly source that first caused kingship to descend now quietly relocates it when the time is right. In this vision, political upheaval stops being random chaos and becomes part of a higher choreography. Cities rise and fall, dynasties bloom and collapse, but the motion has direction. It is not just stronger armies winning battles. It is destiny, rearranging where its authority will live next. This is deeply comforting if you belong to the latest dynasty on the list. Your success is not just luck or violence, it is proof that the same cosmic process that once favoured the legendary kings of ancient Kish now favours you. It is also, perhaps, a little worrying, because if kingship has moved before, it can move again. The King List structure quietly acknowledges that no city gets to keep the mandate forever. The refrain, "Then kingship was taken too," is both a badge of honour and a memento mori. It says you are important, but you are not the end of the story. Beneath this overarching pattern, though there is tension. On one side you have local traditions. Each great city had its own chronicles, its own temple archives, its own proud memories of heroic rulers and divine favours. Uruk remembered Gilgamesh. Lagash remembered Anatium and his conquests. Akkad remembered Sargon and Naram Sin. These stories did not naturally line up into a single straight line. They overlapped, contradicted, and ignored each other. On the other side, you have what we might call an all-Mesopotamian story, a narrative that treats the whole land between the rivers as a single historical stage, on which one kingship performs an endless monologue, changing costumes but never handing over the script. The King List is one of the earliest surviving attempts to build that kind of pan-regional history. To do it, the compilers had to make choices. Which city traditions get foregrounded? Which kings are folded into the big line, and which are left out or minimized? When two local histories claim glory at the same time, whose version is elevated, and whose becomes a footnote or disappears entirely? We can catch glimpses of those decisions by comparing the list with other sources. A powerful ruler that looms large in his own city's inscriptions might appear on the King List with a much shorter reign than local documents suggest, or be omitted altogether. In other cases, the King List gives a dynasty to a city that seems more theoretical than real, perhaps because later scribes needed a way to bridge gaps in the sequence. The formula kingship was taken to acts like a stitching point at each of those seams. It says whatever the details, however many competing stories there were at the time, the only thing that ultimately matters for our master narrative is that at this moment the right to rule moved here. This is where the impossible numbers start to plug in. Those enormous reign lengths, the hundreds and thousands of years assigned to antediluvian kings and early dynasties, are not just floating out there by themselves. They live inside this framework of moving kingship. The structure of the list tells you how to interpret them. They are the measure of how long a given city or dynasty held the one true kingship before heaven decided to move it on. If you think of kingship as a sacred charge, then time under that charge becomes a kind of spiritual quantity. A very long reign, or a very long series of reigns in one city, signals that the cosmic order was content to dwell there for an age. Short, fragmented dynasties suggest something more fragile, more troubled, a kingship restless to move again. Later sections of the list, dealing with better documented historical periods, still use this pattern, but the reigns shrink to plausible human scales. Early on though, especially before the flood, the same rhetorical machinery is pushing everything to extremes. Kingship doesn't just visit Eridu or Bad Tibera. It lingers there for spans of time that push beyond ordinary human imagination. Within the ideology of the list, that exaggeration has a purpose. The primordial rulers and the earliest cities are not just first chronologically. They are first in sacred weight. They anchor the whole chain that follows. Giving them vast, heavy blocks of time is one way to show that foundation. So as we move deeper into the king list and start looking closely at those gigantic numbers, it helps to keep that refrain in mind. Then kingship was taken too, is the track on which all those figures are laid down. The years are not random, they are lengths of tenancy. Units measuring how long the divine franchise chose to reside in one place before it moved along. To understand why those spans grow so huge at the beginning, we have to look at what kind of years the scribes might have been thinking in, and how Mesopotamian ways of counting and symbolizing time could turn reigns into something larger than life. If you follow the list all the way back to its beginning, the refrain about kingship moving from city to city eventually runs into a wall, a kind of cosmic divider. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, and then, much later, then the flood swept over. Everything before that line belongs to what scholars usually call the antediluvian section. Literally, the before the flood kings. This is where the numbers stop just being impressive and become almost absurd. 8 kings ruling 5 cities are said to reign for a combined total of more than 200,000 years. Individual reigns run into tens of thousands. One king in some versions rules for nearly 36,000 years. Another holds kingship for 28,800. Even when the figures vary between manuscripts, they vary within the same astronomical neighbourhood. Nothing in the later, better documented stretches of Mesopotamian history looks remotely like that. Even in periods where we suspect the reigns are rounded up, we're dealing with decades, not geological ages. That contrast is not accidental. The text is asking you to feel it. When you read the list straight through, you pass from these immense, fog-shrouded reigns into something that slowly starts to resemble ordinary time. It's like walking down a mountain, out of air that's too thin for breathing, into a world where lungs and clocks and human lives all work the way you expect them to. The line that marks that transition is the flood. It's tempting to jump on that word as if it were a GPS coordinate, to ask which flood? When exactly? Was it this river avulsion, that regional inundation, some post-glacial meltwater surge that left a trace in the sediment? Those are interesting possibilities, and people have proposed candidates. But within the king list itself, the flood isn't behaving like a normal datable event. It's functioning as a narrative hinge. On one side, time is different. On the other side, it starts to behave. The text doesn't describe the flood in detail. It doesn't tell you how many cubits the waters rose, or how many days the storm lasted. That's the job of other stories, like the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Akkadian Atrahasis myth. In the King List, the flood is more of a dividing line drawn across the page. Before it, impossibly long reigns, semi-mythic kings, cities like Eridu and Larak, bathed in divine proximity. After it, shorter reigns, more cities, more turnover, a world that looks closer to the one scribes actually knew. You can think of it as a reset button on cosmic time. Mesopotamian tradition isn't alone in doing this. Many ancient cultures park their earliest rulers and culture heroes in a special elastic kind of time that doesn't map cleanly onto human lifespans. In early Egyptian king lists, the first sovereigns are not quite human. There are reigns of the gods, then the followers of Horus, spanning thousands of years, long before the first recognizable pharaohs show up. Manetho, the Hellenistic Egyptian priest whose king list survives in fragments, gives dynasties of gods and demigods whose tenures stretch back tens of thousands of years before the first historical kings of the first dynasty. In the Hebrew Bible, the antediluvian patriarchs live for centuries. Adam, 930 years, Methuselah, 969. After the flood of Noah, lifespans steadily contract. In later biblical books, people live for decades, maybe a century if they are very blessed and special. Again, a boundary marked by a flood, with time working one way before and another after. Early Greek tradition preserves something similar. Hesiod talks about successive ages of humanity, golden, silver, bronze, heroic, iron, each with different relationships to the gods, different lengths of life. Other Greek sources give lists of kings in places like Argos that run back into a misty prehistory, where the line between God and man is blurred. The numbers attached to those early figures are long, symbolic, rarely meant as literal civic record. Seen against that wider backdrop, the Sumerian antediluvian kings look less like an oddity and more like one version of a very old narrative move. You create a sacred beginning by stretching the first part of the timeline until it feels qualitatively different from everything that follows. Part of what is going on here has to do with status. Origins are powerful. The first city, the first temple, the first king, these become foundational points on which later legitimacy rests. Making those origins vast in time, coated in divinity, sets them apart from the mundane churn of later politics. If you are a scribe in the early 2nd millennium BCE, writing under a dynasty that wants to see itself as the latest bearer of a sacred tradition, it helps if the tradition's roots are anchored in an age that is obviously not like the present. An age when kings could walk with gods, when lifespans themselves testified to a different order of existence. Hyperbole becomes a tool for marking that difference. When the King List tells you that one of the earliest rulers of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, it is not simply giving you a big number because big numbers are fun. It is telling you this is not a man like the kings you know. This is a figure operating in a different register, nearer to the divine source of kingship itself. His reign isn't just long, it's qualitatively immense, like a geological era compacted into a single name. The flood, in that light, is less a meteorological event and more a conceptual curtain drop. On one side of the curtain, primordial kings whose tenures are measured in great blocks of sacred time. On the other, human kings whose lives and reigns, while still sometimes grandly presented, belong in the same general scale as your grandparents. That doesn't mean there was no memory at all of actual floods. Mesopotamia is a river plain. Floods were a fact of life. Stories about particularly bad ones, or sequences of them, likely circulated for centuries. Those memories could easily have been woven into myths like Atrahasis or the flood of Utnapishtim, and those myths, in turn, could have influenced how scribes thought about structuring the king list. But the function of the flood inside the list is more architectural than documentary. It gives the timeline a two-story shape, before and after. It tells you that the world did not just slowly evolve from one state into another. There was a break, a cosmic punctuation mark, after which the rules were different. Why build the past this way? One possibility is simple grandeur, presenting kingship as something that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, passing through an age of God-touched rulers, before arriving at your dynasty, amplifies its weight. You are not describing a political office that popped up 2 centuries ago, when some warlord won a battle. You are describing a cosmic institution that was already ancient when the rivers first carved their beds. Another possibility is mythic distance. By pushing the earliest kings far back into deep time, you insulate them from verification and from competition. No neighbouring city can easily claim, "Actually, we had a king earlier than Eridu," if the Eridu king's reign begins tens of thousands of years before the world you all recognise. The sheer scale of the numbers makes contradiction impractical. Those beginnings belong to story, not to the kind of local squabbles you might still be having with the city next door. A third has to do with cosmic order. In Mesopotamian thought, time, space, and authority are often linked through patterns. There are numbered lists of gods, fixed sequences of ritual acts, astronomical cycles that tie celestial events to earthly ones. It would not be surprising if the enormous reign lengths of the antediluvian kings were aligned, at least in some scribes' minds, with numerological schemes, sacred factors, or cycles of the heavens. By assigning the primordial kings great, patterned spans of years, you can make the opening era of kingship resonate with the larger rhythms of the cosmos. These intentions are not mutually exclusive. A single set of inflated numbers can do all 3 jobs at once: magnify the antiquity of kingship, place the earliest rulers safely beyond mundane contest, and harmonize the story of human authority with an imagined structure of sacred time. If we listen to the King List with that in mind, the antediluvian section starts to sound less like a mistaken attempt at record-keeping and more like a deliberate act of myth-making. The impossible reigns are not clumsy errors, they are signals. They tell you that you have stepped into a different kind of time, and that when you step back out, somewhere after the flood, you should expect the rules to change. Exactly how those numbers were constructed, and whether the years they use match the way we count time, is another question. Mesopotamian scribes did not think about numbers the way we do, and the way they wrote and combined units could itself inflate or transform the impression of duration. To get any closer to what those vast totals might have meant in their own numerical universe, we have to turn from kings and floods to the way Sumerians counted, to sexagesimal math, sacred units, and the peculiar way big numbers behaved in cuneiform. When you and I look at a number like 28,800, our minds tend to do one very simple thing. We see years, we think, roughly 300 lifetimes, and we imagine a straight line of calendar pages flipping from one to the next. The scribes who wrote the Sumerian King List did not live in that mental universe. They were thinking in base 60. If that phrase makes your eyes want to close, that's fine. We're in no rush here. Just let the idea settle in. Instead of organising large numbers around tens and hundreds and thousands the way we do, Mesopotamian scribes stacked and grouped things around 60s. You already live in a little pocket of that system. Every time you say there are 60 minutes in an hour, or 360 degrees in a circle, you're using fragments of the same numerical world. Imagine counting like this: 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 59. And then, instead of inventing a brand new symbol for 60, you slide over one place and write 1 in the 60s column. Just like we go from 9 to 10 by shifting over into the tens place. They went from 59 to 1-0 in the base 60 sense, one group of 60 0 ones. To them, 60 was not just 6 times 10. It was a fundamental block. A kind of numerical brick you could build big structures out of. Now, across that base 60 landscape, They had special names for certain large, round quantities. A Babylonian mathematical text preserving older traditions talks about units called sos, ner, and sar. The exact details and how consistently they were used are debated, but the general picture goes something like this. A sos is 60. 60 of those, 60 times 60, give you 3,600. That unit is called a ner, 60 ners stacked together. 60 times 3,600 give you 216,000. That's a sar, sos, ner, sar. 60, 30, 600, 216,000. All of them perfectly smooth in a base 60 world. All of them pleasingly divisible, fitting neatly into that sexagesimal grid. Now go back in your mind to those long antediluvian reigns. Some of the most famous numbers in the King List, when you write them in base 10, just look like big random integers. 21,600 years, 28,800, 36,000. On a modern page, they're just hunks of digits. But if you convert some of them back into a base 60 way of thinking, or if you treat them as combinations of units like sos and ner and sar, patterns start to emerge. A reign of 36,000 years, for instance, can be expressed as 10 ners. 10 times 3,600, a big clean multiple of a sacred unit. A reign of 28,800 can be written as 8 ners. 8 times 3,600. Other reigns can be decomposed into sums of these sexagesimal building blocks, so many sos, plus so many ners, plus perhaps a sar here or there. Once you're tuned to it, you start seeing combinations of 60 and 600 and 3,600 running through the early part of the list like a rhythm line under the melody. This doesn't mean every number in the text can be neatly parsed this way. Manuscripts differ. Copyists made mistakes or improved things. And we shouldn't imagine a single universal system running unchanged from the earliest Sumerian tablets to late Babylonian math exercises. Cultures shift. Conventions drift. But the very fact that many of the most striking antediluvian reign lengths seem to cluster around round sexagesimal totals is enough to make scholars pause. Because in a society where numbers themselves could carry symbolic weight, those round totals are suspiciously beautiful. Think about the way people today sometimes like to anchor important events on big, clean dates. A company wants to be founded on January 1st. An anniversary trip is scheduled exactly 10 years after the wedding. Governments round off economic statistics. It's about 1 million, they'll say, even if the precise figure is a bit lower. There's an aesthetic pull toward neatness, toward pleasing patterned totals that look right on the page. Mesopotamian scribes lived in a world where that tendency was amplified by a complex system of numerical symbolism. Certain numbers were linked to gods. Others were associated with planets, rituals, omens. Lists of deities might be given in numbered orders that mirrored astronomical cycles. Calendar schemes tied months and festivals into repeating structures. In that environment, assigning a primordial king a reign of 10 ners, 10 perfect blocks of 3,600 years each, may not have been a neutral statistical report. It may have been a kind of ideological design choice, a way of saying, this king belongs to the realm of completeness, of totality, of cosmic rounds. Once you start looking at the early reigns in that light, questions multiply. Is a king given 8 ners because 8 ners corresponds to some traditional cycle, some sequence of generations or ritual periods? Is another given 60 sos, or some stack of sos plus ner that aligns his reign with a particular pattern cherished by temple scholars? We do not have a master key that unlocks every choice. Ancient texts that explicitly explain these reign lengths are so far silent. Later mathematical tablets use sos, ner, and sar in practical contexts, scribes calculating bricks, fields, or rations. But they do not turn around and say, by the way, Here is why the antediluvian king of Eridu reigned precisely 8 nears. Still, the coincidence between sacred-looking units and impossible reign totals is suggestive enough that many researchers talk about a numerological layer built into the king list. The idea is not that the numbers are arbitrary, but that they are meaningful in ways other than this is how long the man was literally on the throne. Number here becomes a language of its own. A king with 1 sar of reign, a full 216,000, would be occupying an almost unimaginable block of time. But more importantly, he would be standing on a symbol of maximum scale, a complete great unit. A king with multiple nears might be echoing the length of a great cycle, a sequence of kings whose reigns add up to a beautifully rounded grand total might be less a historical ledger and more a kind of cosmic architecture laid out in digits. This is one reason that scholars pay so much attention to the totals provided in some versions of the list. After naming the 8 antediluvian kings, some manuscripts give you a sum. Altogether, they reigned 241,200 years, or some similarly vast total, depending on the version. That combined figure itself can often be broken back into units like sar and ner. It looks less like a random accumulation of odd little reigns, and more like a deliberately constructed rounded block of primordial time, as if the whole first chapter of kingship has been poured into a few enormous, even-edged containers. When a document that purports to be a historical list starts producing totals and subtotals that are this mathematically tidy, it raises interpretive questions. Are we looking at precise archival data from impossibly long-lived rulers, faithfully added up by generations of careful bureaucrats? Or are we looking at a later scribe or series of scribes who are massaging inherited traditions into patterns that satisfy a numerical ideal? Some of the same doubts arise when we notice repeating reign lengths in later parts of the list. Kings who reign exactly 40 years or 30 or 60. Shorter figures now, but still suspiciously round. There, too, the numbers may be doing double duty, giving a sense of duration, and at the same time, signalling something about completeness, legitimacy, or divine favour. In a way, this should not surprise us. Ancient Mesopotamian writing grew up in the service of accounting. The first proto-cuneiform signs track barley, livestock, temple offerings. Number and record were bound together from the beginning. But that marriage cuts both ways. If you're a culture that thinks, prays, and builds with numbers, then when you turn to the past and try to shape it into a coherent story, you're unlikely to leave those numerical instincts at the door. You bring them with you. You let them help structure the mythic scaffolding of your history. The result is a text like the Sumerian King List, where reigns before the flood are both time spans and symbolic weights. Their very shapes, in a sexagesimal sense, tell you something about how that era is supposed to feel. Vast, ordered, aligned with some imagined grid of sacred arithmetic. This perspective doesn't automatically solve the puzzle of what 28,800 years meant on the ground. It doesn't tell us whether anyone ever sat down and tried to convert those ners and sos into something like our calendar years. But it does suggest that we should be cautious about treating the big numbers at face value, as if the only issue were whether human bodies can survive that long. Before we even ask what a year is in this context, we have to recognize that the digits themselves may be doing symbolic work, arranged to create pleasing symmetries and rounded totals in a sexagesimal sky. And that leads to the next question. If the units and bases are so different, is it even right to assume that year means what we mean by it? Or could some of those enormous figures be using different underlying measures of time, reign terms, lunar cycles, festival counts, that got translated into years on the tablet, but were never intended to match a human lifespan 1-to-1? If you've ever heard a skeptical friend talk about the King List, you've probably heard some version of this idea already. Those aren't real years, they'll say. They must have meant something else. Months, maybe, or some special kind of term. If you just convert the units, the numbers become reasonable. It's an attractive thought. It takes those alarming reigns of tens of thousands of years and tries to gently compress them back into something a human body could plausibly live through. No immortality, no super kings, just a misunderstanding about what the unit meant. So let's sit with that possibility for a while. What if the word that gets translated as year in our modern editions wasn't always pointing at a 365-day span? What if, in some periods or in some contexts, it really meant month, or season, or regnal cycle of some sort, like a fixed block of time used for counting a king's term? Ancient cultures did this sort of thing all the time. The Bible has patriarchs whose ages many readers have tried to rescue by saying the original numbers were months. Egyptian texts sometimes count reigns by years of the king tied to particular festivals. Greek cities could reset counting systems when a new magistrate took office. The idea isn't outlandish in principle. The question is whether it works here. The word we're dealing with in Sumerian is usually rendered as something like mu plus a time sign in the cuneiform. In normal administrative texts, that sign is just a year, a straightforward civil year used for dating documents, year so and so, when king so and so did such and such. The same basic vocabulary shows up in the king list. So at one level, the conservative reading is simple. When the list says Dumuzi ruled 36,000 years, and it uses the same word for year that other tablets use for tax receipts and contracts, the plainest interpretation is that the scribe meant the same basic unit. A year is a year, but human language is rarely that tidy. Words drift, units slide around depending on context. A year of barley might not map perfectly onto a calendar year. A regnal year might be counted from a coronation date that floats with the moon. This is where unit shift theories sneak in. Imagine, for instance, that when a later Babylonian scribe copied an old tradition about antediluvian kings, he faced an archaic counting system. Maybe those ancient stories had measured royal spans in months. 12 of those made up what we would call a year, but the text simply said years, because by his day, that was the standard term. He does his best to translate or normalize it, but the unit quietly inflates along the way. If you assume that, the math looks much friendlier. Take a reign of 36,000 labelled years on the tablet. Divide by 12, treat them as months, and you're left with 3,000 of our years. Still enormous, of course, but less shockingly so. Push harder. Maybe those months were shorter ritual periods, or maybe the scribes had overlapping ways to reckon time, lunar years versus solar years, agricultural seasons versus formal calendar cycles. The temptation grows. There must be some clever conversion that shrinks these reigns down to size. You can play with seasons instead. Suppose a year in the story's home tradition meant one harvest cycle, or maybe one half year from flood season to dry season. Now 28,800 years might mean 14,400 such units, or 7,200 depending on your assumptions. You can keep scaling and dividing until you reach lifetime length spans. The problem is that at some point you're not interpreting the text anymore. You're reverse engineering the rules you wish the scribes had used. There are deeper challenges too. One is consistency. The king list doesn't just give impossible figures for antediluvian kings and then stop. As you move down the tablet past the flood, into dynasties we can cross-check against other inscriptions, the numbers come down. You start seeing reigns of 24 years, 36 years, 7 years, 43 years, and in some of those cases we have independent evidence, building inscriptions, date formulas that confirm the same order of magnitude. Those later kings are using the same word for year, and now, clearly, we're in the realm of normal lifespans and reigns. If we decide that in the mythical early section year actually means month, But in the later, historically grounded section year flips to year in our sense, we're positing a hidden switch that the text itself never hints at. Somewhere around the flood, we'd have to imagine the unit quietly resizing by a factor of 12, just at the point where reign lengths conveniently need to become realistic. That sort of move is possible, but it starts to look like special pleading. We adjust the rules not because the tablets tell us to, but because our modern intuition balks at the long figures. Another difficulty is that unit compression doesn't always give you elegant, plausible numbers. Take a reign of 28,800 years. If you divide by 12 for months, you get 2,400. For what we know of early state structures, a single continuous 2,400-year monarchy is still absurd. Divide again. Treat those 2,400 as seasons or as some smaller festival unit, and you soon end up with reigns that are bizarrely short. A cosmic king ruling for 80 weeks or 50 harvests might make poetic sense, but it's not obviously more realistic historically. Some scholars have tried to map the big reigns onto astronomical cycles instead. What if those years are really counts of lunar months or Venus appearances or some zodiacal round? If you squint hard enough, you can sometimes get totals that line up with known Mesopotamian cycles, like 60-year Jupiter-Saturn patterns or larger composite periods used in omen literature. But the fit is never perfect across the board. One reign might divide neatly into a favoured cycle, the next refuses to cooperate. You can explain one king by Venus synods, another by lunar eclipses, a third by Jupiter, but you lose a unified system. The King List, on the other hand, presents its numbers in a single, unbroken format, as if they all belong to the same scale. There is also the question of how scribes actually talked about time in documents we can read plainly. We have administrative texts that span multiple kings, that reckon the years of one reign, and then add on those of another to get cumulative totals. We have year names marking particular events. Year the canal of Ningirsu was dug. Year after the year, so and so. We see no evidence that, within a given period, scribes quietly swapped the underlying unit midstream. When they meant months, they could say months. When they meant days, they could specify days. When they meant in regnal year of a king, they wrote that clearly. The basic calendar vocabulary by the time of the King List was flexible but not cryptic. All of this doesn't mean that every unit shift idea is doomed. It's quite possible that some of the oldest traditions behind the King List were framed in time concepts that had drifted by the time late scribes wrote them down. An old tale might have said, "He ruled for X generations," or "for so and so great cycles," and a later scholar trying to harmonize things might have translated that into years out of habit. We do sometimes see traces of this. Other Mesopotamian texts talk about years of the moon, years of the sun, months of the king, even days of kingship in poetic contexts. There is clearly more than one way to slice the temporal pie. And when we look very closely at certain reigns, especially transitional ones, there are a few that could in theory be reconciled to plausible lifetimes if we assume some modest unit adjustment. Say that early years were lunar years of about 354 days, not solar ones, or that some reigns were initially recorded in 10-day periods and later recopied as whole years without comment. Those are the bits where unit shift theories feel least forced, where a small nudge in the scale can bring an otherwise puzzling figure into line with what we know from archaeology or other texts, without having to reinvent the whole system. But we run into a wall when we try to apply the same trick to the truly gargantuan antediluvian reigns. Shrinking them by factors of 2 or 3 or 12 simply produces smaller but still mythic spans. To crush them all the way down to human reign lengths, you have to compress so hard that you lose any clear connection to the scribe's own conceptions of time. And here is where our evidence runs out of breath. We do not have an ancient commentary tablet that says, "In those primordial days," What we now call year was only such and such. We do not have a colophon where a scribe confesses, I translated old months into new years to make things fit. We have hints in calendar texts, scattered clues in omen series, overlapping ways to reckon time in temple rituals, but nothing that directly bridges the king list's enormous figures to a clearly different unit. What we can say is this: the word on the tablets is the ordinary term for year. In later, checkable parts of the list, that word behaves like a normal year, something on the order of a solar cycle. Attempts to reinterpret the same word as month or festival cycle, only in the earliest section, are clever, but they create as many problems as they solve. Modest unit shifts might help explain the odd reign here and there. They do not, on their own, turn 10 ners into a retirement age king. So when we ask whether those years meant something else, the honest answer is a layered one. They may carry echoes of older, different ways of marking time. They may be stretched, stylized, or aligned with cosmic cycles that mattered more than literal chronology. But as far as our surviving evidence goes, we cannot simply convert them all away into neat, realistic lifespans with a single trick of the calculator. Which brings us to the next angle of the puzzle. If the units themselves probably aren't hiding a secret compression switch, then we're left facing those long numbers more or less at face value. And that raises a different kind of question. Not did they mean months, but did they actually think a king or any human could live that long? To approach that, we have to step out of sexagesimal arithmetic and into flesh and bone. We have to ask what ancient Mesopotamians believed about human bodies, aging, and the far end of a life. In other words, we have to put these reigns next to what we know of real human biology. When we talk about impossible reigns, it helps to notice that there are really two different questions tangled together. One is about how long a human body can live. The other is about how long a tradition can say someone ruled, whether or not that lines up with any biological reality. Those aren't the same thing. They don't even have to be close. Let's start with the simpler side, the biology. As far as modern science can tell, our species hasn't changed dramatically in maximum lifespan over the few thousand years since the first cities. Diets, medicine, and safety have changed average outcomes, but the upper ceiling, the raw potential of a human body, seems to have been similar for a very long time. In skeletal remains from ancient Mesopotamia, the pattern is stark. Most people died young by our standards. Infant and child mortality were brutal. Many adults never saw their 50th year. When you average everyone together, you get life expectancies down in the 20s or 30s. But that doesn't mean nobody ever got old. Even in harsh conditions, some individuals reach 60, 70, occasionally beyond. We see arthritic joints, worn teeth, healed fractures, bodies that carried the marks of long lived in decades. And among elites, the odds get a little better. Better food, less hard labour, protection from some forms of violence, access to whatever counted as medical care at the time. Kings, queens, high priests, powerful officials, they were never guaranteed long lives, but they were at least competing in an easier league than the farmers digging irrigation trenches. When we look at later, well-documented Mesopotamian kings, their reign lengths reflect this reality. Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian rulers often reign for a few decades. Some make it into the 40-year range. A handful here and there hit what feels like the biological upper band, 50 years on the throne, maybe a bit more if they started young and were unusually lucky. Even then, those are exceptional careers, not the norm. So if we imagine a king becoming ruler in his 20s, surviving palace intrigue, war, disease, and accidents, and living a full span by ancient standards, a continuous reign of 40, 50, perhaps 60 years is already pressing against the high end of what we see historically. That's our baseline. That's what human bodies in that environment can plausibly do. When the King List talks about reigns of 36,000 years, we're not arguing about the fine print of biology. We've left the curve entirely. We're in another register. This is where the second question comes in. What exactly is being described when the text says a king ruled for that long? We tend to assume a reign is a straightforward thing, the period during which one physical person occupies the office of king, a crown on a single head for a continuous stretch of years until death or deposition. But even in more ordinary histories, reigns can be fuzzier than that. Sometimes a son co-rules with his aging father. Sometimes a usurper takes the throne, but later scribes erase his memory and glue his years onto a more legitimate predecessor. Sometimes a dynasty claims that its founder still rules symbolically, while his descendants act as stand-ins. If you pull on that thread, the idea of reign length starts to look elastic. In the Mesopotamian world, kingship itself was bigger than any individual. It was a divine institution, a sacred office that could, in theory, outlast every particular body that wore it. A king might be seen as a temporary vessel for a much longer-lived thing, the kingship of a city, or a dynasty, or even of humanity in relation to the gods. Now imagine you're a scribe centuries after the supposed age of the first kings. You're handed stories from the deep past. They tell you that in the primordial time before the flood, when the gods were closer and the world was different, kingship was concentrated in a few luminous figures who ruled for ages. What exactly does that word mean in those stories? It might not be referring to a biological lifespan at all. It could be gesturing at the length of a tradition, the duration of a sacred order, the time during which a particular royal cult or city held preeminence. By the time you sit down with stylus and clay, the way your tradition talks about more recent kings is strictly chronological. So you do the obvious thing. You take that vague mythic "he ruled for ages" and you express it in the same numerical format you use for everything else. You give it a number, and not just any number, a big, impressive, sexagesimal friendly number that says, this was not an ordinary phase of history. This was the time when kingship itself was colossal. In that sense, reign lengths can be symbolic, even when the names they're attached to are not invented from whole cloth. A real local chieftain could have lived. He might have ruled for 20 harvests, led real people, oversaw real struggles. His memory could fuse with that of his successors, accumulate stories, stretch across generations. When tradition finally crystallizes into a written list, his reign might represent the entire arc of a city's early kingship, compacted into one heroic ancestor. The number used to express that arc is no longer a pale reflection of a life lived in days and nights. It's a statement, almost a slogan. This period was enormous. It lasted 10 ners, 1 sar. It filled the calendar. There is a social function to that kind of exaggeration. Portraying founders as extraordinarily long-lived does more than entertain. It anchors a community's sense of age and importance. If the first kings of your tradition ruled for tens of thousands of years, your city isn't just old. It is rooted in an almost cosmic timescale. Its institutions aren't recent improvisations. They are inheritances from an epoch when humans and gods negotiated the architecture of the world. Long reigns also smooth out awkwardness. Dynastic breaks, coups, civil wars, these can all be stitched into a single monumental span. Instead of admitting that your sacred city lost kingship several times, you can present a story in which it once held kingship for an unimaginably long continuous age. Later interruptions become minor ripples in a deep, unbroken current. And for later rulers copying or reading the list, these huge numbers work as a quiet piece of propaganda. A king in the present who can link himself by genealogy, city, or divine favour to figures who ruled for 36,000 years inherits some of that weight. His reign, however short in reality, is framed against a backdrop of timeless kingship. He isn't just a man trying to hold a throne, He is the current expression of something that once stretched across the ages. All of this pulls us away from any simple literal reading. But we don't have to swing to the opposite extreme and say, it's all fiction. Nothing in it reflects real lifespans or reigns at all. Ancient texts often live in a mixed zone. Some names in the King List are historically attested elsewhere. Some reign lengths further down the list are perfectly modest, well within biological possibility. Others are clearly stylized, rounded to multiples of sacred numbers, arranged to make neat totals. It's entirely possible that the antediluvian section also lives in that mixed space. Maybe there was once a remembered core of real rulers whose actual reigns were long by early standards, 40, 50, perhaps even 60 years for particularly hardy kings. Over centuries, as stories were retold and theological ideas deepened, those spans could have been inflated, aligned with divine numbers, padded to fit cosmological schemes. Or maybe the inflation came first. Perhaps the very idea of the first king demanded a scale beyond ordinary life, and dates were retrofitted later when scribes wanted to systematize mythic time. We can't see the process directly. The intermediate stages are gone. What we're left with is a finished literary product, kings with names, each assigned a reign length that uses the everyday word for year, some figures humanly possible, some quietly stretched, some blown past the horizon. So when we set human biology next to those impossible reigns, we're not just checking the math, we're watching two different logics rub against each other. On one side, bones, cells, fragile bodies that wear out in less than a century. On the other, a tradition that uses the language of years and kingship to talk about something vast, the age of beginnings, the dignity of cities, the authority of dynasties, the long shadow of the gods. Whether we choose to read the antediluvian reigns literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between depends on which of those logics we think the King List is serving most strongly at any given line. The text itself doesn't tell us outright. It just lays the numbers down and moves on. To push further, we need another line of comparison. Not just between biology and inscription, but between the King List and the world around it. Other flood stories, other ancient, long-lived patriarchs, and the way numbers swell whenever humans talk about the beginning of time. That's where we go next as the flood arrives and the reigns begin to shrink, but never quite settle into the ordinary. After the flood, the text does something quietly dramatic. It changes the scale. Before the flood, we're living in a world where one king can rack up 36,000 years on the throne, another 28,800, another 43,200. Time is swollen, elastic, openly mythic. Then the waters recede, kingship descends from heaven again, and suddenly the numbers start coming down. Not to normal, not yet, but from astronomically impossible to merely outrageous. In the standard version of the Sumerian King List, the first dynasty after the flood is Kish. Its early rulers are still given reigns in the hundreds of years, some in the thousands. They're huge, but compared to the antediluvian monsters, they are noticeably trimmed. It's like the text is walking down a staircase. First step. The pre-flood colossi, tens of thousands of years, entire geological epochs in a single lifetime. Second step. The earliest post-flood kings, hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 years. Still far beyond human biology, but closer to the ground. Then, as the list moves forward through dynasty after dynasty, Uruk, Wan, back to Kish, the reigns, on average, keep trending downward. You start seeing numbers like 60 years, 36 years, 25 years, mixed in, every so often, with a throwback. A 900-year reign here, a 1,200-year reign there, like little aftershocks of myth in a gradually stabilizing landscape. Keep going further into dynasties that we can anchor with independent inscriptions, and the numbers begin to look even more reasonable. 20-year reigns, 12-year reigns, a king who ruled 5 years and was gone, the kind of pattern you'd expect in a real unstable political environment. By the first dynasty of by the time you're close to figures like Mesanepada or Gilgamesh's supposed era, we've left the tens of thousands completely behind. Some reigns are still exaggerated or rounded, but the background level is moving into the realm of human possibility. Then, later still, by the time we hit the kings of Larsa, Ezin, Babylon and Assyria, the figures that modern chronologies are built around, the numbers in the king list, are often in the same ballpark as the reign lengths we can reconstruct from year-by-year records. That trend, a long slide from impossible to plausible, is not unique to Sumer. You see it in other traditions too, in slightly different clothes. In the Hebrew Bible, the patriarchs before the flood live for 900 years or more. After the flood, the ages start dropping. 600, 400, then 200, then eventually lifespans that, while still generous, sit much closer to what ancient humans could actually reach. In early Chinese dynastic legends, the first rulers are sometimes said to have reigned for centuries. As tradition moves closer to the historically documentable Zhou and Qin, the spans contract into decades. You could almost draw a graph. Myth at one end, chronicle at the other, with a long gradient in between where numbers are half remembered, half designed. The Sumerian King List sits right on that gradient. It doesn't flip abruptly from fantasy time to calendar time. It slowly walks the listener down, one dynasty at a time, from the age when kingship is cosmic to the age when kings are mortal, and their reigns must fit, at least loosely, inside what a human body can do. But even as the trend leans toward plausibility, the text never fully gives up its taste for the strange. Some of the early Kish kings after the flood are allotted reigns like 1200 years or 960 years. Later dynasties might have strings of modest, believable reigns, then suddenly one ruler is given 150 years on the throne, surrounded by neighbours who rule for 10 or 15. Scholars have noticed patterns in these oddities. Some of the overlong post-flood reigns cluster around dynasties that claim special prestige, Kish as the first city to hold kingship again, Uruk associated with culture heroes, with its powerful, later remembered rulers. Sometimes reign totals for a whole dynasty add up to neat, rounded numbers in sexagesimal, suggesting that the scribe was just as interested in elegant arithmetic as in sober reporting. It feels less like someone making clumsy mistakes with dates, and more like someone shaping time to do specific work. If we think in terms of a myth-to-history gradient, the flood becomes a kind of hinge. Before it, the numbers are openly mythic. After it, they begin to negotiate. On one side of the hinge, kings are almost like gods in narrative time. They anchor vast spans. They exist more as principles than individuals. On the other side, kings are increasingly like us. They are born, rule for a stretch, and die, leaving records we can sometimes dig out of the ground. In between, there is a long, foggy slope where reigns are treated as elastic, but not infinitely so. You can sense the tradition starting to feel the pull of chronological realism, without fully surrendering its impulse to exaggerate for effect. This in-between zone is where the King List is most revealing. It shows us how a culture can hold two ways of talking about the past at the same time. On one track, you have careful scribes who, in other genres, record year names tied to real events. Year X, the king destroyed such and such city. Year Y, the temple of such and such god was built. Those year names pile up, one by one, to form reliably sequenced reigns. On another track, you have the King List itself, which condenses dynasties, smooths over overlaps, and sometimes adjusts reign lengths so that power seems to pass in a dignified, almost seamless order from city to city. The result is not accidental confusion. It's intentional blending. A text like the King List is not trying to do what a modern chronological table does. It's not written to satisfy an archivist, it's written to make a statement about how kingship moves through the world. To accomplish that, it has to draw on several reservoirs at once: oral memory of real rulers and events, temple archives with practical date lists, mythic stories about heroes and founders, theological ideas about how the gods distribute kingship among cities. Those sources don't all agree in detail. They don't even talk in the same register. So the scribe's job isn't simply to transcribe, it's to harmonize. Sometimes, harmony means compromise, shaving a little here, adding a little there, rounding a 37-year reign up to 40, or compressing a chaotic sequence of short-lived usurpers into the reign of one long-lasting, more presentable king. Sometimes harmony means outright stylization, deciding that the first post-flood dynasty should feel grand, and therefore inflating its reigns so that they bridge the impossible time before the flood with the more human time after. Seen from this angle, the coexistence of plausible and implausible numbers isn't a bug. It's a feature. Exaggerated reigns advertise sacred antiquity and divine favour. Plausible reigns provide enough realism that the list can plug into other, more sober traditions. The text wants to feel both timeless and anchored. Later kings copying the list could point to the early exaggerated rulers when they needed to stress continuity with a near-mythic age. They could point to the more modest reigns when they wanted to emphasize their place in a tangible recent sequence. And beneath all that, something else is happening. As you follow the list line by line, you are being gently led from a world where nothing is checkable to a world where, if you wanted, you could put the clay tablet down, walk into the royal archive and verify. Names in the later parts of the list start to line up with royal inscriptions carved on steles and temple walls. Some reign lengths, or at least their order, begin to match what we can reconstruct from contemporary documents. We move from kings whose only home is this list and scattered legends, to kings whose bricks we've found, whose campaigns we can trace, whose year names are preserved on economic tablets that once sat in merchants' houses. That's the shift we're edging toward, from a universe where reign lengths are a kind of poetic measure of importance, to a universe where they can be cross-examined by other texts that had very different reasons to care about dates. The King List doesn't announce that shift. It doesn't say, now, from this point on, you can trust me more literally. It just keeps writing, calmly passing from the fog of early dynasties into the clearer air of documented history. To see how that clarity emerges, and where the list still bends the facts for its own purposes, we have to step outside the tablet and start comparing. We need to bring in building inscriptions, votive offerings, year name sequences, and even other king lists, and set them alongside this grand narrative. Only then can we see exactly where the numbers of the king list match, where they wobble, and where they quietly ignore reality in order to tell a better story. So let's step outside the king list for a while and walk through that archive. Because the Sumerians didn't just leave us one grand narrative tablet and call it a day. They wrote constantly. They wrote on clay for taxes, for temple inventories, for land sales, for lawsuits, for rations of beer. They wrote on stone to boast. They wrote on tiny cones to commemorate the building of a wall. They wrote on door sockets, on foundation pegs, on statue bases. Out of that flood of writing, a few kinds of text are especially important for checking the king list. One is royal inscriptions. These are the I so and so king of such and such did this magnificent thing texts. They're often short, formulaic, and obsessed with building and war. A king repairs a temple and has a brick stamped with his name. He digs a canal and erects a little stone marker. He wins a battle and sets up a stele. Each of these objects may only say a few lines, but those lines usually include the king's name, his titles, the city he rules, sometimes his father's name, and very occasionally a reference to another ruler elsewhere. Another rich source comes from a far less glamorous side of life, Administrative tablets. These are the receipts, the ration lists, the temple ledgers. Clay tablets with entries like month so-and-so year. The king destroyed such and such city, 10 measures of barley to the workers, or year the canal of the god Enlil was opened, 1 sheep to the overseer. Which brings us to a crucial institution in Mesopotamian timekeeping, year names. Instead of saying in 2123 BCE, or in year 5 of King X with a neutral number, early scribes often named each year after a notable event that had just happened. So you get labels like year the king built the wall of city A, year after the year city B was defeated, year the temple of goddess C was refurbished. These names weren't just ceremonial. They were how people actually dated contracts and administrative actions. A scribe would write, on the 15th day of the month, in the year the king destroyed city B, so and so received such and such. Over a king's lifetime, those year names pile up in sequence. Year 1, the year of X. Year 2, the year after the year of X. Year 3, the year the temple was built, and so on. If we find enough tablets from a given city, we can reconstruct a nearly continuous list of those names, in order. That gives us what's called a year name sequence for that king. Now, when you overlay those sequences with royal inscriptions and with the king list, interesting things start to happen. Take a well-documented dynasty like the third dynasty of Ur, usually called Ur III. From Ur the 30 we have hundreds, actually thousands of economic tablets with year names. We can line them up and see that Shulgi, for example, has a long, well-attested series of years. We can see that his son Amar-Sin follows him, then Shu-Sin, then Ibi-Sin. Their order is secure because contracts carry multiple anchor points. In the year such and such with the seal of such and such official, who we also know from other documents. When we flip back to the king list, we do indeed find Shulgi, Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, Ibi-Sin as successive kings of Ur. The sequence matches. The list didn't invent them. It didn't scramble them. It's clearly drawing on the same historical memory that the archive preserves. Or consider the kings of Akkad: Sargon, Rimush, Manish-Tushu, Naram-Sin, Shark-Ali-Shari. Their names are on monumental inscriptions from cities spread over a vast region. The order of succession is implied in those inscriptions, phrases like Rimush, son of Sargon, Naram-Sin, son of Manish-Tushu, and confirmed by year name sequences. Again, the Sumerian King List includes these names in the same basic order. It doesn't get everything perfect, but the broad line is there. These are synchronisms, points where independent streams of evidence line up. They tell us that by the time we reach these later, better documented periods, the King List is not free fantasy. It's working with real, historically grounded data. The same happens when we bring in other king lists. Mesopotamia loved lists. Scribes later in the 2nd millennium BCE compiled Assyrian king lists, Babylonian king lists, and local chronicles that preserve sequences of rulers in their own regions. They weren't copying the Sumerian king list, they had their own traditions and political agendas. Where those later lists overlap chronologically with the tail end of the Sumerian king list, we can compare. Sometimes the agreement is striking. A line of kings from Izin or Lhasa will appear in both the Sumerian king list and a later Babylonian list, in the same order with reign lengths that are at least in the same neighbourhood. When that happens, confidence goes up that we're looking at a shared underlying reality. Other times, the disagreements are just as instructive. Some local lists include short-lived rivals or co-rulers that the Sumerian king list quietly ignores. Some adjust the order of a few rulers to emphasize continuity in their own city. Some assign different reign totals. These clashes remind us what kind of document the Sumerian king list is. It's not a neutral database, it's one version of the past among several. shaped by particular scribes in particular cities. Now, where does the King List disagree with the evidence in more obvious ways? One classic issue is overlap. We know from economic tablets and inscriptions that in some periods multiple city-states had kings simultaneously. While one dynasty ruled in Isin, another was ruling in Lhasa. While one line sat on the throne in Ur, independent kings might still be active in other cities. But the Sumerian King List usually presents kingship as if it were a single baton held by one city at a time. Kingship descends to Kish, then is carried to Uruk, then to Ur, and so on, as though the whole land only had one legitimate ruler at once. Administrative records contradict that picture. They show coexisting courts, rival claims, and messy politics. The King List chooses to compress that into a clean, serial narrative. It ignores local rulers who don't fit the story of a single continuous line of true kingship. Another disagreement lies in the lengths of reigns. Because we can count year names for some rulers, we can estimate how long they actually ruled. In the best cases, those counts line up reasonably with the King List's figures. A king with 21 attested year names may be given a reign of 19 or 24 years in the King List, close enough that we can imagine scribal rounding or lost years. But in other cases, the gap yawns. A ruler who seems to have only 8 or 9 year names in the archive suddenly has a 36-year reign in the King List. Or the reverse, a king with a surprisingly rich sequence of year names gets a compressed, modest total in the list because he happens to fall in a dynasty the compiler wants to hurry through. Sometimes you can see the math at work. Reign totals for a dynasty come out to neat sexagesimal numbers, multiples of 60, suggesting that the scribe was adjusting the individual reigns to hit an elegant target number. When that happens, it's hard to believe the figures were simply copied from archival reality. This is where it helps to separate two different questions. One, is a given king real in the sense that he ruled a city, issued decrees, had his name on bricks? Two, even if he is real, is the number of years assigned to him in the King List an accurate count? In many cases, the first question has a solid probably yes. A name appears on multiple independent inscriptions, on bricks in different temples, in year names on routine documents. That's strong evidence that we're dealing with a historical figure, not a pure invention. But the second question is rarely so clear. For some later kings, where year-by-year evidence is dense, we can say that the King List's reign length is broadly plausible, close enough that we can treat it as essentially historical, allowing for small scribal errors. For earlier rulers, even those verified by independent inscriptions, the numbers in the King List are much shakier. They may be inflated for prestige, rounded to fit a pattern, or distorted by later confusion. That's why historians tend to talk in probabilities rather than certainties. They'll say things like, "It is likely that this king reigned in the late 3rd millennium," or "the sequence of rulers is secure but the reign lengths remain uncertain." They build chronological models that weigh each piece of evidence, year names, synchronisms with astronomical events, cross-references in foreign texts, archaeological strata. When all those pieces point in the same direction, confidence grows. When they conflict, scholars propose different reconstructions, each with trade-offs. The Sumerian King List is a powerful part of that puzzle, but it's not the puzzle itself. It's one voice in a noisy room. Royal inscriptions talk over it. Administrative tablets whisper under it. Other king lists argue with it. Together, they create a chorus of overlapping, sometimes discordant memories of who ruled when. Listening to that chorus, you start to hear patterns in the noise. Some stretches of the King List are anchored tightly by independent evidence. Others float almost free. Some reign lengths clearly echo the slow, practical ticking of year-by-year records. Others ring with the smooth, rounded tones of literary design. If you're expecting a simple verdict, this part is true, that part is false, the result can feel unsatisfying. Instead, what emerges is a textured landscape of likelihoods. Early dynasties, especially before the flood, live almost entirely in the realm of story. Mid-range rulers may be half historical, half schematic, their names preserved but their reigns stretched or squeezed. Later kings step out onto firmer ground, surrounded by documents we can count, categorize, and correlate. And all along that path, the king list is shaping reality as much as it is recording it. It validates some rulers by giving them a place in the great chain of kingship. It diminishes others by omitting or compressing them. It bends reign lengths to make dynasties feel more impressive, or to hit pleasing numerical totals. When we cross-check it against inscriptions and year names, we're not just fact-checking an ancient chronicle. We're watching a culture negotiate between memory, myth, and math. We're watching scribes decide, again and again, what kind of past they want to have. And that brings us to the next question. Why would they want a past that looks like this? Why smooth over rivals, inflate certain kings, and present power as if it passes in an orderly single file from city to city? To answer that, we have to talk about propaganda, legitimacy, and what it means, in a world of many small kings, to claim that your kingship is the one that truly counts. Imagine you're a king in Mesopotamia. You don't rule a modern nation with borders on a map. You rule a city with its fields and canals, its temples and walls, plus whatever neighbouring towns you've managed to bully into paying taxes. Right over there, a few days' march away, another king claims to rule just as legitimately as you do. He has his own temple, his own scribes, his own gods, or, more accurately, his own local versions of the same gods you worship. Nobody has tanks, nobody has radio, nobody has mass media. What you do have are scribes, and clay, and a deep shared fascination with lists. In that world, writing down a story of the past isn't just a hobby. It's a weapon, a very slow, very patient weapon. One of the simplest tricks is also one of the most powerful. You put yourself in a line. Instead of just saying, I am king, you say, I am king number 37 in an unbroken sequence that goes back to the dawn of time. You don't stand alone. You are the latest link in a chain that began when kingship descended from heaven. All those who came before you, all those city rulers, flood survivors, empire builders, they were just holding the office until it finally arrived at its proper home, your city, your dynasty. Listing predecessors like this performs a kind of magic. It makes your reign feel inevitable. If kingship has always been handed down from one legitimate holder to the next, then your presence on the throne is not just the outcome of wars and coups. It's the outcome of cosmic procedure. The list doesn't say this king murdered his rival and seized the palace. It says, then kingship was carried to Kish, or or Ezin. A smooth transfer like a ceremonial relay, not a messy civil war. That's one obvious agenda the Sumerian King List may have served. To portray history as a single, orderly line of real kings, so that whoever sits at the end of that line can say, look, the universe agrees I should be here. Another agenda has to do with unifying a landscape that's anything but unified. Remember those multiple city-states ruling at the same time, all calling their leader king? On the ground, power is fragmented. Different cities fight, ally, betray, and coexist in an overlapping patchwork. But if you're a ruler with big ambitions, that patchwork is a problem. You want people to think in larger units, the land, Sumer and Akkad, eventually, all the four quarters. You want loyalty that stretches beyond one city wall. A king list that shows power moving, one at a time from city to city, does something clever. It turns a noisy crowd of rival capitals into a single historical subject, kingship. Kish has it, then Uruk, then then Akkad, then back to Cities that were once piers become stations on a pilgrimage route. Each of them in its day held the sacred office that now rests permanently in your hands. This narrative quietly tells people there has always been one kingship that matters most. There have always been many local rulers, but only one true bearer of heaven-sent authority at a time. And now that bearer is you. That kind of story softens regional pride and rivalry. If you're from a city that used to be glorious but is now second-rate, the King List offers comfort. Your city still appears in the chain. Your ancestors hosted kingship once, so supporting the current legitimate king lets you share in that larger prestige. You're part of the same grand story. At the same time, the list can be used to sideline rivals. Because what goes into a list is only half the game. What gets left out is just as important. If there was a local strongman who broke away for a few years, proclaimed himself king of the Four Quarters, and then got crushed, one way to deal with his memory is to erase him from the authoritative sequence. The King List says, in effect, that didn't count. By omitting pretenders, usurpers, and inconvenient quarrellers, the scribes are drawing a line between history and noise. The rulers who appear on the list are presented as legitimate manifestations of kingship. Everyone else becomes a footnote at best, a ghost at worst. And even among those who are included, the way they are treated sends signals. A dynasty you want to highlight might get carefully counted, with reigns that add up to an impressively solid total. A dynasty you want to minimize might be rushed, several kings with oddly short reigns, or a quickly summarized stretch, as if saying, yes, they existed, but nothing truly important happened there. There are also the kings who are technically acknowledged but never elaborated. A name, a number, and then we move on. No stories, no legendary feats, no evocative nicknames. Lack of narrative is a kind of demotion. Behind all this is scribal culture itself. Scribes weren't neutral data entry clerks. They were educated elites, trained in temple schools, supported by palaces and priesthoods. Their schooling involved copying texts, memorizing standard compositions, mastering traditional formulas. The King List is one of those compositions. It's part of a curriculum. Reciting after the kingship descended from heaven, Kish became the seat of kingship, isn't just historical, it's ideological training. It teaches that kingship is heaven origin, city moving, unitary. Who pays the scribes? The very institutions that benefit from that view of the world. Temples gain from a picture where divine favour moves in an orderly way, attached to recognised kings who properly fund rituals. Palaces gain from a story that makes their rule look ancient, inevitable, and cosmically endorsed. So the scribes, consciously or not, produce texts that reflect and reinforce that worldview. We can even see this in the way numbers are used. Very long reigns in the antediluvian section don't just make those kings sound old. They make them sound qualitatively different. 28,000 years isn't a statistic. It's a banner waving, this is the age of myth, of God-touched rulers, of unimaginable greatness. As time goes on and reigns shorten, the pattern itself tells a story. We are moving from the vast golden ages of origin into more ordinary times. Yet within those ordinary times, some reigns are still stretched. A dynasty that wants to project stability might have its king's reigns nudged upward, smoothed out so that they look long and steady. A few very short reigns in the middle of a supposedly glorious line might hint at chaos, assassination, divine displeasure. If you're polishing the prestige of your patrons, you may want to minimize that impression. Think of it like this. Years on the King List are not just measurements. They're adjectives. 60 years says, this was a substantial ruler. 120 years says, this was a pillar of the age. A comically long figure in the deep past says, this is beyond normal human experience. Treat with awe. Even the neat totals at the end of dynasties, those satisfying multiples of 60, function rhetorically. They tell listeners that a particular dynasty wasn't just a random pile of kings. It was a completed unit, a finished chapter that came to a proper, numerically elegant close. That harmony between math and story suggests intention. Someone wanted the past to look tidy, balanced, well-proportioned. Not because life was that way, but because a well-ordered past helps justify the present order. All of this doesn't mean the King List is a cynical forgery. It probably felt true to the people who used it. Its vision of kingship as a single heaven-descended institution moving through time matched their religious and political sensibilities. But if we look at it with modern eyes, we can see how it merges fact and propaganda. Real rulers anchor it. Real struggles and successions lie behind its lines. Yet the way they're arranged, who gets included, who gets ignored, how long they're said to have reigned, which cities receive the honour of hosting kingship, serves the ideological needs of particular dynasties and institutions. In a world without newspapers or television, that clay tablet becomes a slow-burning broadcast. Every time a scribe copies it in a school, every time a priest or official cites it in a dedication, the same message whispers through the culture. Kingship is one, kingship is ancient, kingship moves where the gods will, and right now it rests with us. Once you see that, the enormous reigns at the beginning, the smooth transfers, the polished totals, start to look less like wild mistakes and more like rhetorical choices. Which leads to another question. If the King List is partly a work of propaganda, what does that mean for its most famous dividing line, the flood? Is that huge cosmic event also being used to tidy up history and legitimize rule, the way reign lengths and city sequences are? To explore that, we have to step out of the throne room and look at rivers, mud, and memory. When we talk about the flood in Mesopotamia, it's tempting to imagine one single story, one giant event, one gigantic wall of water, one perfect line connecting the Sumerian King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis myth, later biblical traditions, and maybe some archaeological layer of silt. Reality is much messier, and in many ways more interesting. Mesopotamian texts don't give us one flood. They give us variations on a flood motif that keeps getting retold, re-aimed, and repurposed. In Atrahasis, the flood comes because humans are too noisy and the gods can't sleep. In Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells his flood story as part of a lesson about mortality and the limits of human striving. In other compositions, the flood is a line in a hymn, a reference point, a background assumption. There was a time before the flood, there is a time after the flood. The King List plugs right into that pattern, but with its own priority. It doesn't care much about why the gods drowned the world or how the hero survived. It cares about this. Before the flood there were kings, then the flood happened, then kingship descended again and the line resumed. For the King List, the flood is less a full story and more a hinge, a cosmic punctuation mark. To see where that hinge might have come from, it helps to think less in terms of one global catastrophe and more in terms of a landscape that is, by its nature, periodically catastrophic. Southern Mesopotamia is not a quiet place. Two big rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, branch and braid and wander across flat plains. They rise with snowmelt from distant mountains. They swell with seasonal rains that may be generous one year and vicious the next. A small change upstream can mean a huge change downstream. Most years, those floods are life. They bring water and silt, recharge the fields, fill the canals, support the entire agricultural system that makes cities possible. But every so often, the balance tips. A levee breaks at the wrong time. An unusually heavy snowmelt coincides with a storm front. Channels already narrowed by sediment can't handle the surge. Water pours out over the plain. In a land that is barely above river level to begin with, there's nowhere for it to go. Settlements, fields, shrines, roads, everything vanishes under a smooth sheet of brown. For people living in a single city-state or a cluster of villages, such a flood doesn't feel local, it feels total. If your entire visible world has turned into water, if you watch houses crumble and livestock drown, if you escape by boat or by clinging to a raised temple mound, it is entirely reasonable to describe the experience as the whole land was destroyed. Multiply that by centuries and millennia. You don't need one unique megaflood to generate a powerful cultural memory. You just need a repeating background of dangerous high water, punctuated by occasional events that are genuinely devastating for a particular region. Archaeology in Mesopotamia bears this out in a frustrating, tantalizing way. At several ancient cities, Shuruppak, Kish, others, excavators have found flood deposits, layers of clean silt or clay between older and newer occupation levels. These suggest periods when a settlement was inundated or abandoned and then reoccupied. For a while, especially in the early 20th century, this looked promising. Maybe one of these layers, the flood layer at Shuruppak for instance, was the flood. A neat match between tablet and trench, a single catastrophe generating a single myth. As more sites were dug and dating methods improved, that neatness fell apart. The flood layer at one city doesn't match the flood layer at another. They're separated by centuries. In some places there is no clear flood layer at the right time at all. What emerges instead is a picture of many floods, of varying scale and impact, scattered over a long period. From the point of view of geological and archaeological evidence, there is no obvious single event that screams, "This is the one true flood behind every story." And even if there were a promising layer, a substantial flood deposit roughly at the time some scholars think the antediluvian kings would belong to, bridging that gap between mud and myth would still be tricky. A layer of silt tells us that water covered a site, that people left or rebuilt. It does not, on its own, tell us that the inhabitants thought of that flood as divine punishment, or as a universal reset, or as the moment when kingship was interrupted and later restored. It certainly doesn't tell us that centuries later, scribes would decide to treat that event as a cosmic line, dividing mythic reign lengths from more ordinary ones. Trying to map a literary flood directly onto a specific flood layer is like trying to match a dream to a single night's sleep. There may be a relationship, but the dream is also built from older experiences, cultural expectations, borrowed images, and narrative needs. The King List sits right at that intersection between physical experience and narrative need. On one hand, the idea of a huge, destructive flood that wipes away cities and peoples is utterly plausible in a river plain. People really did watch water erase whole neighbourhoods. They really did see old settlements buried and new foundations laid on top. On the other hand, the King List is not writing a disaster report. It's organising time. It has already made a major move by giving antediluvian kings those impossibly long reigns. It has already drawn a contrast between the before time of giant figures and the after time of more mortal-sized rulers. The flood, placed right at that transition, performs a structural function. It says there was a world of kings that existed under different conditions, and that world ended in a single overwhelming event. After that, something restarted. Kingship descended again. This is more than just a dramatic pause. It's a way of compressing a long, complex and probably very blurry past into two clean compartments. Instead of an indefinite stretch of early rulers fading into legend, the list gives us a sealed box labelled Before the Flood and another labelled After the Flood. The hinge between them is not a gradual shift in political organisation or population size. It is a moment when the old order is literally washed away. This kind of partitioning is something human memory and storytelling seem to like. Disasters, especially sudden ones, offer convenient anchors in time. People say before the fire, after the earthquake, since the war. Events that are personally or socially traumatic become markers that reorganize how we remember everything else. In oral cultures, those markers can stretch further. A truly great flood might become not just the bad year when the fields were ruined, but the time when the old villages perished, or the age when the gods were angry, or the boundary between the people before and the people now. Across generations, as stories are retold and fitted into larger religious and political frameworks, the disaster abstracted from any specific date acquires mythic weight. Instead of that flood, it becomes the flood in the King List. That process has gone one step further. The flood isn't only a remembered calamity, it's also a narrative tool for organizing kingship. It provides a natural place to reset the clock. Everything before is allowed to be strange, alien lifespans, semi-divine kings, patterns that don't fit the more recent historical reality. Everything after can be brought closer to human experience, even if many reigns are still unrealistically long. This doesn't mean the flood in the King List was invented from nothing. It probably draws on a shared cultural pool of flood memories and flood stories that were already circulating in southern Mesopotamia. It also doesn't mean there was no especially bad flood, or series of floods, that lodged in regional memory as more significant than others. There may well have been. The point is that by the time we see the King List in written form, that sediment of experience and tale has been shaped to do work inside a particular story about power. Kingship does not just appear, drift around, and then settle. It descends, is hosted by cities, and at one decisive moment is interrupted. The flood is the divine scale event big enough to justify that interruption. Once you see the flood in the King List as both environmental echo and narrative hinge, some of its other features fall into place. The antediluvian kings can be impossibly remote because they belong to a qualitatively different era, now firmly sealed off. The post-flood kings can be treated as the beginning of real lineages, even when their own reign lengths are still highly stylized. And the whole structure can be used by later dynasties to say, in effect, we do not just follow other cities, we follow an entire world that died and was reborn. In that sense, the flood is doing the same kind of ideological work as those carefully shaped reign totals and that smooth transfer of kingship from city to city. It cleans up history. It draws a bold line where reality was probably a tangled mesh of gradual changes, overlapping traditions, and many lesser disasters. It gives the impression that there was one great cosmic reset, one neat break that separates unimaginable antiquity from the more graspable, documentable past. For sleepy historians like us, this leaves a lingering question. If the flood in the King List is part environment, part memory, part rhetorical device, then what should we make of those early reigns on either side of it? Are they distorted reflections of real rulers who lived near real floods? Purely symbolic placeholders meant to fill out a cosmic timeline? Or something stranger, a blend of both, suspended somewhere between the mud of the plain and the stories scratched into clay? To approach that, we have to weigh the explanations we've gathered so far: numerical systems, propaganda, disaster memory, human biology. Then ask as gently and precisely as we can, what parts of those first reigns might be possible, and what parts are almost certainly dream work. So let's put the question on the table and just let it sit there for a moment. Were those first reigns, the ones that stretch for thousands and tens of thousands of years, humanly possible? If we mean, could an actual biological human being with a heart and lungs and a nervous system like ours sit on a throne for 18,000 solar years, the answer is almost certainly no. But that's the easy part. The real work is to ask what kind of thing those numbers are, and what combination of explanations fits them best with the least amount of stretching. We can start by laying out the main candidates. One is symbolic numerology. On this view, those reigns are not failed journalism, they're deliberate patterns. The numbers are built from special values in the sexagesimal system, multiples of 60, of 600, of 3,600, stacked and combined in ways that would have felt meaningful to the scribes. Here the years function less like clock ticks and more like sacred units. The point is not En-men-Luana literally reigned 43,200 calendar years, but his reign is equal to 12 great circles of time, or his period on the throne completes a cosmically satisfying sum. This fits very comfortably with what we know about Mesopotamian thought. Numbers could be qualities as well as quantities. Totals could be tuned until they harmonized with myth, ritual, or theology. A second explanation is ideological myth history. In this reading, the antediluvian section is not trying to preserve straightforward memory of the deep past. It is sketching a mythic preface that makes the later political world feel anchored and legitimate. Real cities are there: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. But the figures attached to them are exaggerated into a different order of being. The long reigns are like halos, they say. These are more than kings. They are semi-divine bearers of the first kingship, living at a time when rules were not yet what they are now. Here the numbers are tools of elevation. The farther back you go, the bigger things get. A third explanation is unit conversion. We've already seen how slippery year can be. Maybe these aren't solar years at all. Maybe they're months or seasons or 10-year reign terms, or even counts of ceremonial cycles. Perhaps an original, more modest unit was later misread as year when scribes recopied old material into newer formats. This path tries to rescue literal plausibility by shrinking the ticking unit. And then there is scribal tradition itself. Over many centuries, tablets get copied, standardized, harmonized. Variants are smoothed out. Local oddities are pulled into a common framework. A number that begins as a very long time in one text can, through repetition and systematization, harden into a precise reign total in another. At that point, future scribes are copying something authoritative. They might not fully understand how it arose. They just know it belongs. The King List we see could be the end product of many such rounds of editorial crystallization. So, which of these explains the antediluvian reigns best? If we weigh them, some fall into place more neatly than others. The idea that the numbers were meant as literal lifespans in ordinary years has the heaviest burden. It clashes with everything we know about human biology. It requires us to assume that multiple early kings had radically different physiology from any documented human, and that this extreme longevity then vanished without leaving clear traces in later medical or mythic traditions, except as vague memories. It also doesn't explain the numerical patterns. Those giant reigns are not random. They are often built from repeated factors, neat sexagesimal blocks. They look constructed. The pure unit conversion model, actually, they just meant months. So divide by 12 and now it's realistic, eases the biological problem but creates others. When we convert, the numbers rarely land neatly on historically believable reigns. Some become too short, others remain implausibly long. And more importantly, unit conversion by itself doesn't tell us why only the pre-flood kings would be counted that way, while post-flood kings slide toward more ordinary figures. Changing the unit solves a piece of the puzzle but leaves the overall structure untouched. Symbolic numerology and ideological myth history, by contrast, explain both the magnitude of the numbers and their position in the narrative. If the antediluvian section is conceptualized as a qualitatively different era, a time of beginnings, inhabited by larger-than-life figures, then inflating reigns into cosmic quantities, makes sense. You advertise that difference by giving the early kings durations that no mortal ruler could match. The flood then marks the point at which time and kingship come back down toward human scale. Scribal tradition plays well with this. Once those mythically weighted numbers are in circulation, the process of copying and standardizing will tend to preserve them, even as political realities change. Later scribes, working centuries after any living memory of whatever stories first birthed these figures, are not in a position to correct them. Their job is to transmit, to reconcile, to fit older material into newer frameworks. So a weighted summary might look like this. The numbers themselves, especially before the flood, are best seen as symbolic and ideological, structured by Mesopotamian numerology, and by the desire to present a sacred, magnified origin period. Scribal tradition then carries and polishes that structure across time. Unit conversion might play a minor supporting role in a few odd cases, especially where local calendars or cultic cycles differ, but it's unlikely to be the main engine behind reigns of 28,800 or 36,000 years. That still leaves an important nuance. Symbolic and ideological does not necessarily mean entirely made up from thin air. It is very possible that behind some antediluvian names there were once real leaders, chieftains of early temple communities, remembered ancestors of priestly houses, founders of lineages associated with certain cities or shrines. Over generations their memory could have elongated. Their stories thickened with miracles, divine parentage, improbable age. A leader who ruled for many years becomes one who ruled longer than anyone can recall, then ruled for an age, and finally, in a literate, numerically sophisticated culture, ruled for X times 3,600 years. In that sense, we can imagine a mixed model. Real rulers, or at least real ancestral figures, form the skeleton. Stylized reign lengths chosen to express their cosmic status and to fit nice numerical patterns become the flesh. The same could apply to a lesser extent to the earliest post-flood kings. Their names sometimes show up in other inscriptions. Their cities are archaeologically attested. Their reigns in the King List, however, are often suspiciously rounded or clearly structured totals. Historical core, symbolic envelope. In this light, the impossible numbers stop being useless. They become data of a different kind. They tell us which cities later Sumerians wanted to place at the dawn of things, which dynasties or cult centres were granted the prestige of hosting the earliest kingship, how scribes conceived of time before their own records. Did they imagine a slow decline from a golden age, or a clean break marked by flood and restart? What numerical values counted as cosmic, complete, or properly ancient? Even their very impossibility is informative. It shows a deliberate desire to mark a discontinuity between an unreachable past and the world of ordinary politics. So, when we ask, were those first reigns humanly possible? We can offer a calm, layered answer. No, not in the straightforward biological sense. No human king, in any evidence we possess, has ruled for dozens of millennia. But also, that was probably never the main point of those numbers. What we can responsibly say is that the antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List sits at the intersection of myth, memory, and mathematics. Its kings may preserve echoes of real leadership figures from very early southern Mesopotamia. Their reign lengths are almost certainly literary constructions, shaped by symbolic numerology and by the ideological needs of later dynasties. Scribal tradition over time froze those constructions into the canonical forms we now read. We can't peel them back to a clean, factual chronology of the very first rulers. The numbers will not give us that, but they do give us something else. A window into how ancient Mesopotamians imagined the deep past, how they thought about time, and how they used stories of impossibly long-lived kings to make sense of their own, very mortal political world. To see that clearly is not to debunk the King List. It is to understand the kind of truth it is trying to tell. So now we can step back a little. We've walked from those vast antediluvian reigns that stretch beyond any imaginable human life, down through the post-flood dynasties where the numbers start shrinking, and finally into the territory where we can cross-check kings against year names, building inscriptions and archaeological layers. At one end, kings rule for 28,800 years. At the other, kings rule for 6, 10, 15. Some of those later rulers we can almost meet. We know where they built temples, where they dug canals, sometimes even which enemy cities they claimed to defeat. Across that whole spectrum, one thing has held steady. The Sumerian King List was never just counting. It was arranging. Arranging time, arranging power, arranging memory into a single flowing story. If we return one last time to our core question, were those earliest reigns humanly possible? We can now answer in a slightly deeper way. Not only are they almost certainly impossible as literal lifespans measured in ordinary solar years, they also don't behave like records that were meant to be checked against reality in that way. They behave like something else. They behave like scripture of kingship. They mark off a sacred preface. They describe a flood as a hinge. They line up cities and dynasties in a chain. They let kingship descend from heaven, move from place to place, and finally arrive in the present of the scribes who copied the tablets we have. Seen from that angle, the impossibility is not a flaw. It's a feature. It signals here, in this far zone of beginnings, rules are different. Time stretches, lives expand, numbers turn into symbols. So, when we summarize the strongest explanations, we have to be careful. We can't say with total confidence, this is exactly what the scribes thought, because they did not leave us a commentary spelling out their intentions. But we can say some things with reasonable calm. It is very likely that the huge antediluvian numbers are primarily symbolic and ideological. They make use of Mesopotamian number law, multiples of 60, 600, 3,600, to express completeness, remoteness, and divine quality. They place certain cities and lineages at the very root of political order, giving them prestige by surrounding their founders with cosmic-scale durations. After the flood, as reigns become shorter but still often strangely rounded and patterned, we see the same habits at work in a more historically anchored world. Real dynasties appear, real city-states we can dig and map. But the numbers attached to some of those kings continue to bear the fingerprints of literary shaping, neat totals, suggestive repetitions, clean sexagesimal blocks. Unit conversion, years that might originally have been months or 10-year terms or ritual cycles, could have played a role in a few cases, especially where local calendars differed. But it is unlikely to be the main engine behind reigns in the tens of thousands. Scribal tradition, working slowly across centuries, smoothed messy old stories into ordered lists, reconciled variant traditions, and froze particular numbers into authority. And somewhere behind all that, filtered through myth and mathematics, there may well have been real leaders, real communities, real crises that seeded the names. Historical cores, symbolic skins, put all of this together, and the King List stops being a puzzle that refuses to solve and starts looking like an answer to a different question. Not how many years did this king actually rule, but how did later Mesopotamians want political time to look? In the world of the King List, time is not a flat, uniform stretch of days. It is layered. There is a before and an after, separated by flood. There is a realm of beginnings, where reigns are impossibly long and kings are almost godlike. There is a middle world where dynasties rise and fall, kingship moves to one city and then another, and numbers edge closer to what we would recognize as human scale. And there is an implied present, where scribes sit with clay and stylus, looking back over that whole arranged sequence and deciding how it should flow. This is one of the quiet lessons of the King List. Power in this text is not just the ability to command soldiers or build canals. It is the ability to locate yourself in time. If your dynasty can claim that kingship once came to your city, if your ancestors appear in that long line descending from the heroes before the flood, then your rule is not just a temporary accident. It is part of a pattern, part of a story that began when the world was young. And the scribes, in their own way, are powerful too, with their choices, what to include, what to smooth, which numbers to standardize, which cities to honor. They shape that pattern. They turn scattered memories, local traditions, temple lists, and political boasts into an ordered timeline that tells people who they are and where they came from. We can't hear their voices directly. We have only their columns of names and numerals, their repeated phrase. Then kingship was taken too. But if we sit with those lists a little while, another picture emerges. You can imagine a scribe in a city like Nippur or copying an older tablet by lamplight. He pauses over a huge reign number, one of those tens of thousands, and he doesn't erase it. He doesn't try to fix it to match the lifespans he sees around him. He honors it. He passes it on, because for him, that number doesn't have to match a birth certificate. It has to match a feeling. The feeling that long ago, before anyone alive could remember, there was a time of greatness, a time of first things, a time when kings were closer to gods, and years were not counted as we count them now. That is what the King List reveals most clearly, not a literal chronology of the first rulers, but a culture's deep desire to weave its politics into the fabric of cosmic time. We, looking back, can separate the strands a little. We can say the biology doesn't work, the math is symbolic, the flood is mythic memory, maybe tinted by real floods. The early kings are more legendary than historical. The later kings increasingly step into the light of documentation. But we can also let another kind of truth stand alongside that analysis. Humans, from the earliest literate societies to our own, tell stories that are bigger than the facts that started them. We stack numbers into patterns, we stretch lifetimes into legends. We arrange the past into lines and cycles and golden ages, not because that is how it really happened in every detail, but because that is how it feels meaningful. The Sumerian King List is one of the first surviving attempts to do this in writing. A long, careful breath taken by a civilization exhaled into clay. As you drift towards sleep, you might picture those columns of names as a kind of distant murmur, generations of kings, real and imagined, marching past in slow motion, cities rising and falling like tides, and in the quiet between them, the steady work of anonymous scribes, turning chaos into sequence, turning memory into text, turning the unfathomable depth of the past into something you can trace with a fingertip from top to bottom. That in the end may be the most humanly possible thing about those impossible reigns. They are not records of superhuman lifespans. They are records of a very human urge to put the world in order by telling a story about time. If you found this slow walk through ancient kings and stranger numbers soothing or interesting, it helps a lot if you gently tap like or subscribe so you can find your way back to more nights like this. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment with where you're listening from, what city, what country, what kind of night surrounds you while you listen to the echoes of Sumer. For now, you can let the list fade into the background. The kings will keep their places on the clay. The numbers will go on, meaning more than they can literally say. And the story of time, power, and memory will keep flowing quietly, just as it has since someone, somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, first pressed a stylus into wet clay and began to write. After kingship descended from heaven,